Chapter 21:21. All along, according to Luo Fan's understanding, any divine ability or power seemed to be transformed into heaven and earth at the highest level. The only difference was whether the heaven and earth was at a higher or lower level, strong or weak. After all, as far as he knew, the most perfect and powerful existence was the heavens and earth. This understanding could not be said to be wrong. It was just that after reaching his current level, this understanding was obviously no longer perfect. After all, he had already seen many things that were more powerful and more perfect than heaven and earth. For example, the chaotic state was the most typical existence that was more perfect and powerful than heaven and earth. Others, such as the various mysterious magic treasures created by true saints and Tao Masters, the Tao Master's Path, and the fragments of something that surpassed primordial origin spiritual treasures, weren't these all more powerful and more perfect than heaven and earth? Therefore, it could be said that if he still held the attitude that heaven and earth was the most perfect and magnificent, and any divine ability or power would be transformed into heaven and earth at the highest level, it would obviously be a little inappropriate. And this understanding was the root of the change in him just now. What he had displayed was a collection of many concept magical abilities. Originally, he had completely reconstructed it according to the content of the world of laws, hoping to completely transform it into a perfect world of laws. That was why the collection had become such a broken world and such a crude world. However, after he realized that he was out of place, he suddenly understood. Why did he need to transform the collection of many divine abilities into heaven and earth? This was not because he wanted to build a perfect world of laws, but to use it against the enemy. Did it matter whether it was heaven and earth, and whether it had the perfect balance of heaven and earth? As long as he could superimpose and sublimate the power of all the divine abilities, wouldn't it be fine? Did it matter whether it was heaven and earth, and what kind of performance it had? After realizing this, he instantly found that the world in front of him had opened up in an instant. Many of the questions that were entangled in front of him like a fog suddenly had answers. After that, he directly changed the structure of the divine abilities, allowing the characteristics of these divine abilities to superimpose and combine with each other. In this way, the originally broken world was transformed into a state of absolute chaos that was similar to the state of primal chaos. It also allowed it to erupt with unimaginable power, easily suppressing the illusory world the boy had set up, and easily suppressing the convergence of the opponent's many concept divine abilities. Naturally, Luo Fan couldn't explain these changes to the boy. At this moment, his heart trembled slightly. The chaos that seemed to be in a state of primal chaos swept out in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already completely destroyed the illusory world. As it retracted, it had already wrapped around the boy, leaving him only the size of the platform to move around. "Sovereign, let's retreat," the conspirator said to the boy. "Retreat?" The boy was stunned at first, then as if his dignity had been offended, he roared in anger. "How can we retreat? I'm the ruler of the third floor. I still have some tricks that I haven't used yet." With this roar, his body trembled, and the entire third floor of the Tao Master's Road began to shake. For a time, an unknown amount of mysterious power quickly erupted from all over the third floor, and under the guidance of some extremely mysterious mechanism, it quickly gathered at the place where the platform was at this moment, and quickly poured into the platform. As the endless mysterious power was poured into the platform, it suddenly began to wriggle as if it had suddenly been sublimated. All kinds of indescribable light were constantly released from the platform, colliding with the chaotic power that Luo Fan had displayed, causing an earth-shattering movement. Even space-time and the nomological laws began to shake violently. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan frowned. His heart trembled slightly, and he raised his hand to grab at the void. In an instant, the absolute chaos changed, and a power that was thousands of times stronger than before was triggered, pouring towards the platform. The power of the chaos itself was uncertain. Some chaos might cause the power to decrease, while some chaos might cause the power to increase. And some chaos had an extremely obvious effect on some changes, while others were quite inconspicuous. Even Luo Fan still had no way to clearly control the changes that were going on. Only by waiting for time, waiting for him to become more and more familiar with this method, could he control it. At this time, this chaos was stimulated, its power was triggered, and in turn, it blasted the changes of the platform with a more powerful means. This was formed by the combination of Luo Fan's adjustment and the changes of the chaos itself. His power was unparalleled, and of course, it also contained Luo Fan's strong will, and it was also a manifestation of the potential of the divine sense itself. In the face of such a chaotic impact, the platform began to shake constantly, and there were faint signs of instability. At this time, the boy's expression became extremely ugly. He did not stop moving and continued to mobilize the power he could mobilize in the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. Through various magical connections, the power was constantly injected into the platform, causing the platform to constantly transform. The platform was built here to condense the power of the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. However, he originally wanted to use this power to help his cultivation. But now, in the face of Luo Fan, he had to use these means to support his cultivation to fight against the enemy. Fortunately, the power of the third level of the Tao Master's path that he could mobilize was only a small part of the entire third level. But it was also the power of the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. The terrifying effect of this power had reached an unimaginable level. At this time, in the face of Luo Fan's attack, the platform was a little unstable at the beginning, but as time passed, even if the chaotic attacks became stronger, the platform became more and more stable. Vaguely, there seemed to be some kind of earth-shattering existence brewing in the depths of the platform. Seeing the situation develop to this point, the boy's expression did not change much. On the contrary, it became even more unsightly. Just looking at his face, it was easy to suspect that it was not Luo Fan who was at a disadvantage, but him. At this time, the conspirator stood at the side, a trace of curiosity in his expression. He seemed to be curious if the boy's means could deal with Luo Fan. Open! Suddenly, at a certain moment, the boy roared. With this roar, the platform suddenly exploded, and endless brilliance instantly shot out from the exploded fragments. In an instant, like a physical object, it brazenly poured into the surrounding gray chaos created by the divine ability of Luo Fan. In an instant, the chaos was torn apart, and a world was formed within it. The scenery of these worlds was extremely strange. Although each world was quite complete and quite fragile, one could vaguely find similarities in the third level of the Tao Master's path. It felt as if the light had directly transferred the information of the third level of the Tao Master's path to these divine abilities, and directly reconstructed the divine abilities according to the corresponding information. At this moment, Luo Fan received countless feedback. Mysterious and complicated information constantly poured into his heart through the divine ability and constantly integrated into it. It made him feel that his understanding of the third level of the Tao Master's path was growing every moment. In a trance, he almost fell into a state of enlightenment where there was no one and no me. Is this an attack on me? At this time, such a thought could not help but appear in Luo Fan's mind. Looking at the boy's means, it was clearly an attack on him. However, the result of this attack, on the contrary, made him feel that he was constantly gaining benefits. This situation, no matter how one looked at it, was difficult to understand. However, he only hesitated for a short while, and directly immersed his mind into the countless information. No matter what the other party was thinking, at this time, the other party's actions could bring him benefits, so there was no way he would give up. In fact, although this time the battle with the boy had happened somewhat inexplicably, as if it was completely due to the boy's willfulness. The final result made him feel extremely satisfied. Not only did he understand the development direction and sublimation direction of the divine ability in the previous battle, but at this time, with the help of the boy's means, he could carry out a comprehensive and in-depth understanding of the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. For him, this was like a pie falling from the sky, and it was enough to make him very satisfied. Luo Fan stood there quietly, with an inexplicable expression on his face, which contained a kind of indescribable joy. His eyes became even more dazed and blank. However, although his mind was immersed in the understanding, the chaos caused by the superposition of his divine ability became more and more chaotic. Moreover, because of the inclination of his heart, this chaos constantly evolved in the direction of increasing the power. Wave after wave of attacks, one after another, shocking changes after another, constantly poured towards the platform. During this process, it constantly interweaved and collided with the numerous rays of light that were being released from the platform, and then it evolved into countless mysterious and wondrous worlds. At this time, the expression on the boy's face became quite strange. Looking at his face, there was a hint of admiration, some disbelief, and some even gnashing his teeth. He really threw himself into it without any hesitation at all. In this world, there is actually such a practitioner. The original goal of this platform was to condense the power of the entire third level of the Tao Master's path to help his own cultivation. Therefore, when the power of this platform was truly stimulated, although it might contain infinite lethality, no matter how he weakened or changed it, there was absolutely no lack of features that could help his cultivation. That was to say, at this time, even if he wanted to stimulate the power of this platform to become a means of absolute lethality to Luo Fan, it was impossible for him to do so. At most, at the very most, he could add a kind of destructive power to that kind of power. Forget it, why should I be angry with such a person? A sense of helplessness emerged in the boy's heart. According to the boy's original thought, even if this power might bring some benefits, his opponent would inevitably suspect whether there was any conspiracy or some kind of calculation in it, because it was released by his opponent. Therefore, it was impossible for him to be completely immersed in the benefits brought by it. Once he did not dare to be immersed in it, the benefits would naturally become a huge burden, causing him to have to divide a large part of his mental strength to resist. Combined with the destructive power that he added to the power, the strength of the damage could reach an unimaginable level. Maybe it could directly turn the tables and turn defeat into victory. However, he did not expect that Luo Fan in front of him would have such a firm heart for cultivation. Even if it was an attack from his opponent, as long as it contained something beneficial to him, he would not hesitate to accept it. He did not worry at all that the benefits might contain a trap, nor did he worry about whether his opponent was scheming against him. This approach completely destroyed his calculations, causing him to go for wool and come home shorn. Not only could he not attack Luo Fan, but he could also even bring him endless benefit. Under the secret complex emotions, the boy's reason, which was originally covered by his obsession, began to emerge again. At this time, he just realized that there was no irreconcilable relationship between him and Luo Fan. In fact, it was only because he was curious about where Luo Fan was hiding. It was precisely because he was curious about where Luo Fan was hiding that he could not find Luo Fan, no matter how hard he tried, which finally led to the current situation. It could be said that there was no real enmity between them, nor was there any conflict of interest. After thinking about this, he could not help but smile bitterly. This battle happened for no reason at all. At this moment, when he looked at Luo Fan again, the look in his eyes had changed. A kind of admiration finally took the upper hand, suppressing all other emotions. He was also a wandering cultivator, so he naturally knew how difficult it was for a wandering cultivator to cultivate. After all, He had millions of fortuitous encounters and put in a lot of effort to cultivate to this level. As for Luo Fan, he relied on a wandering cultivator to cultivate to this level. His talent was so high that it was beyond the limits of his imagination. He did not have the slightest confidence that he could surpass Luo Fan. Now that he had regained his rationality, how could he not feel admiration? At this moment, he sighed and said to the conspirator, "You can go. You don't need to worry about things here." With that, regardless of what the conspirator did, he swept the conspirator away and threw him to a random spot on the 3rd floor of the Path of Tao Master. This development of the situation was completely beyond the conspirator's expectation, leaving him at a loss at this time. What's going on? Wasn't the battle in full swing just now? Why was I suddenly thrown out? What does this mean? Do they not want to fight anymore, or do they have some tricks to hide from me? He murmured, his heart full of doubts. The boy could guess the conspirator's doubts, but he did not pay attention to it. At this time, he just sat cross-legged and began to immerse his mind into the exploded platform below, blending into the light that constantly penetrated it, and began to carefully comprehend the information contained in the 3rd level of the road to Tao Master. This platform itself was condensed by the power of the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path. Such a platform in itself was actually something that exceeded the limits of his control. If it had not been detonated, he would naturally have been able to decide when the platform would be activated and when it would release the power contained in it. But now, after the entire platform had been detonated, there was no way for him to stop the platform from continuing to explode. In other words, for the current him, he could either directly give up the opportunities contained in this platform and the cultivation principles contained in it, or he could only immerse himself in the light and use the light to absorb the infinite principles condensed from the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path. If this was before, when his reason was obscured by his obsession, there was no need to say that his choice would naturally be to give up the principles and activate the power to make things difficult for Luo Fan. But now that he had regained his reason, he naturally knew what was more precious. He understood which was more important, a moment of anger or one's own cultivation foundation. As he immersed himself in the light, the destructive power contained in the light began to gradually weaken, and the terrifying power triggered by the many divine abilities released by Luo Fan began to become more and more gentle. Finally, at a certain moment, a balance was formed with the light, causing the principles and information contained in the light to be released more smoothly and faster. This change was of great benefit to both Luo Fan and the boy, causing both of them to involuntarily reveal an inexplicable smile on their faces. With this change, this area fell into a strange balance, as if it had turned into a sky curtain, directly occupying a corner of the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path, becoming a holy land for the cultivators in the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path. Chapter 21-22. In the blink of an eye, 100,000 years had passed. During these 100,000 years, countless cultivators nearby had sensed the special changes in the place where Luo Fan and the boy were and had rushed over from all directions to look at the phenomenon that had just appeared on the 3rd level of the Tao Sovereign's path. The moment they saw the phenomenon, they were instantly immersed in the endless mysteries that belonged to the 3rd level of the Tao Sovereign's path. In the eyes of weak cultivators, the casual methods of powerful cultivators were peerless opportunities that contained endless mysteries. Just like the Tao Sovereign's path, wasn't it the methods of many true saints? It went without saying what kind of opportunity it was for cultivators below the Tao Sovereign realm. Similarly, the strength of Luo Fan and the boy had clearly far surpassed the limits of the 3rd level of the Tao Sovereign's path. The methods they were using now were obviously extremely profound methods for the cultivators on the 3rd level of the Tao Sovereign's path, and they were where endless opportunities lay. Over the years, Countless cultivators had used the mysteries of the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path to break through their shackles and obtain the extraordinary power of the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path. There were even some cultivators who had obtained extraordinary power that broke through their final limits and obtained the qualifications to ascend. This kind of benefit was simply the most direct temptation for many cultivators. Under this kind of temptation, more and more cultivators threw themselves into this phenomenon. They continuously tried to comprehend the profoundness within and observe the various profound words that belonged to the third level. Even the order that the boy had established in the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path could not stop this trend of change. In the end, after 100,000 years, the area around this area had formed a circle of settlements, and hundreds of bustling cities had been built. Moreover, the price of land in the city was completely determined by the angle of view of this phenomenon. On this day, at the highest point of a city, the conspirator looked at the phenomenon in front of him and thought, "I didn't expect it to develop to this point." His insight was naturally not something other cultivators could compare to. The other cultivators could only see the endless mysteries of the third level that were revealed in the phenomenon. However, he was different. In his eyes, he could see that during these 100,000 years, Luo Fan and the boy had rejected and resisted each other at the very beginning. Then, they gradually became in sync, and recently, they even complemented each other. Their communication had even reached a level where their hearts were connected to each other. It could be said that they had gone from being like enemies and friends to being close friends. This kind of change was unimaginable to the conspirator, who had been watching how the two of them fought and fought from the beginning. For a moment, he was at a loss for what to do. Perhaps it's because of this mentality that they've reached this stage as independent cultivators. This thought quickly appeared in his mind, and he couldn't help but sigh. The boy and Luo Fan had one thing in common: they were both rogue cultivators. As independent cultivators, they should have stood under all the sects of Tao masters, and it was impossible for them to stand out. However, both of them stood out among the obstacles of many sects of Tao masters, and even made him, a Tao master who had come down from the fourth level of the Tao master's path, feel a sense of despair. The achievements of such an existence were obviously beyond the imagination of all living beings. All along, the conspirator had been attached to the boy and helped the boy to plan all kinds of things. But in fact, in his heart, he also wanted to find out why the boy could be so powerful. However, from the beginning to the present, he had gained very little, and he had no idea why the boy could reach this stage. In his investigation, it seemed that the boy could reach this stage because of one fortuitous encounter after another, one opportunity after another, and one burst of luck after another. Only now, when he saw Luo Fan's similar achievements, did he vaguely understand that perhaps the two of them treated cultivation as their everything. They treated everything that was beneficial to their cultivation as their target, and they treated everything that was detrimental to their cultivation as something they abhorred. That was the only reason why they were able to reach such a stage. Perhaps it seems to be good to continue to follow him. Suddenly, this idea came to his mind again. When he saw that the boy was not as good as Luo Fan, the conspirator actually had the intention to leave. He felt that the boy was no longer a wise master, and was no longer an existence that could become a Tao master as he had thought. But now, after 100,000 years of observation and sensing the boy's unimaginable Taoist heart, the conspirator had unknowingly dispelled his intention to leave. Forget it, anyway, there is no better person to rely on now, so I'll follow him. After a long time, he sighed, and his eyes became firm again. Different cultivators had different ways of cultivation, and it was the same even for the disciples of Tao masters. Moreover, compared to independent cultivators, the disciples of Tao masters had a much richer way of cultivation because they had the guidance of Tao masters. Obviously, the conspirator's way of cultivation seemed to involve relying on others. At this moment, after he made up his mind, the power in his body became more and more active, and his aura suddenly shook and became more and more powerful. The extraordinary power in his body became more and more refined during this process, and the power that could be triggered from the third level of the Tao Master's path became more and more powerful. "There is such an unexpected gain," he murmured, and his expression finally became completely calm. Then, he waved his hand and his body shook. He had already soared into the sky and turned into a huge figure. He arrived in midair and said, "This place is about to disappear. Fellow Taoists, please leave within 3 days. If you don't leave within 3 days, you will bear the consequences." His voice spread through the area around the phenomenon and entered the ears of all the cultivators, no matter how well hidden they were. All the cultivators in the area who were affected by the phenomenon could hear his voice in an instant. For cultivators, there were naturally people who wanted to get lucky, but most of them could still recognize the situation. For a terrifying expert like the conspirator, any words he said would carry a lot of weight to any cultivator. Even if he was just talking nonsense, they would rather believe him than not believe him. Furthermore, they had already faintly sensed many of the things that the conspirator had mentioned. Therefore, at this moment, a large number of cultivators left their places of cultivation and went directly to the void. They bowed to the conspirator and thanked him for his reminder. Then, they turned around and used their own methods to fly into the distance, trying to get as far away from the phenomenon as possible. However, it was clear that, as mentioned before, there were still cultivators who wanted to try their luck. At the same time, there were many cultivators who remained unmoved and treated the words of the schemer as wind passing by their ears as they focused on comprehending the profundities within the phenomenon. The conspirator naturally could not be bothered with these cultivators who wanted to get lucky. In any case, his warning had already been delivered. It was entirely up to the others to decide whether they would listen to him or not and whether they would leave or not. Just as he said before, they had to bear the consequences. Seeing that the cultivators did not leave, his heart stirred. He took a step forward and his figure gradually disappeared. In the blink of an eye, it was as if he had never appeared. Do you think I won't know that you want to monopolize this cultivation holy land just because you're hiding?" A cultivator snorted in disdain and immersed himself in the boundless comprehension. The mysteries of the phenomenon were extremely profound. For the cultivators cultivating on the 3rd floor, the benefits were simply earth-shattering. With such benefits, almost all the cultivators who saw it could benefit and improve. As for those who were lucky and had wonderful opportunities, the benefits they obtained were even more astonishing. Some of them even continuously broke through one realm after another. The cultivators who remained in the cities around the phenomenon were clearly the cultivators who would come later. Only with sufficient benefits would they dare to take such a risk and dare to have such a fluke that would affect their own lives. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. When the 3 days were up, the cultivators began to sneer and laugh. This was because they discovered that the phenomenon did not change at all during these 3 days. Forget about collapsing, there wasn't even the slightest sign of it collapsing or the slightest trace of destruction. This situation made them even more certain of their original thoughts. That cultivator was just trying to scare them. They were absolutely right not to leave. Just as their laughter had yet to dissipate, space shook, and an indescribable fluctuation instantly swept through the surrounding space. As the ripples spread out, the cities that had been strengthened by countless cultivators and set up countless formations gradually collapsed as they rumbled and trembled. The entire process was so simple that it was as if they were not defenses at all but just models made of sand. At this moment, the cultivators turned pale with fright. The shock and regret in their hearts drowned them. However, it was clear that it was already too late. The ripple that easily destroyed the cities also swept through their bodies. In an instant, it broke through their extraordinary power defenses and entered their bodies. It began to disintegrate their bodies, their power, their life source, and even their deeper concept of existence. In an instant, the cultivators collapsed and died, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. In just a single strange ripple, everything that the cultivators had created over the past 100,000 years had completely disappeared. The surroundings had completely returned to the emptiness from 100,000 years ago, as if 100,000 years had never happened. Immediately afterward, the phenomenon trembled, and an earth-shattering explosion occurred in an instant. Terrifying shockwaves swept out in all directions, and the area within the radius of an unknown number of light-years was instantly crushed, directly turning into a chaotic state similar to that of primal chaos. However, the chaos quickly began to condense under the power of the third layer of the Tao Master's path. In the blink of an eye, it had returned to its normal state of clarity. However, all the living beings that lived in this place had completely disappeared. Whether it was the cultivators, the natives of the third layer, or the mindless wild beasts, divine beasts or immortal beasts, they had all disappeared. There was only an indescribable silence that appeared in the area within an unknown number of light-years. After the phenomenon dissipated, there were two figures floating in the void at the center of the phenomenon. These two figures were none other than Luo Fan and the boy. However, at this time, the two of them were no longer in a state where they were at loggerheads. Instead, they were like old friends, and there was an inexplicable harmony between their auras. I didn't expect Fellow's cultivation path to be so mysterious. It's a pity that I can't leave. At this moment, the boy sighed and said to Luo Fan, after all these years of comprehending together, his aura had fused with Luo Fan's, and their thoughts had been exchanged. He had a rather deep understanding of Luo Fan's path of cultivation. Although it was impossible for him to completely understand the true essence of Luo Fan's path of cultivation, he had a rough understanding of Luo Fan's goal of cultivation. He understood the advantages and difficulties of cultivation. Of course, he believed that Luo Fan must have a similar or even deeper understanding of him. For ordinary living beings and even ordinary cultivators, this was equivalent to completely exposing one's secrets. It was an absolutely intolerable situation. However, for the two of them, this was nothing. Whether it was Luo Fan or the boy, they would not take this to heart. That was because at their level, they had already recognized the true essence of cultivation. They had understood that their cultivation path was only suitable for themselves. Apart from themselves, no matter how powerful other existences were, even if they cultivated their own cultivation path, their final achievements would not be able to compare to their own. Under such circumstances, they naturally didn't need to worry about the consequences of exposing their cultivation path. Fellow's cultivation path is also very mysterious, so why are you envious of mine? Luo Fan only smiled faintly. The two of them looked at each other and smiled. Then, the boy asked, I have a question that has been bothering me for a long time. I hope Fellow can teach me. Fellow Taoist, could it be that you want to know where I was hiding all those years? Why couldn't you find it? Luo Fan smiled. Back then, Luo Fan might not have known why the boy was so hostile to him, but after comprehending together over the years and absorbing the nutrients of the third level of the Tao Master's path together, he already knew what the boy's mentality was. He also understood what was bothering him. Yes, I hope Fellow can enlighten me, the boy said with a solemn expression. Luo Fan smiled slightly and said, Fellow should be able to sense where I was hiding now. Why don't you try? Hearing this, the boy was slightly stunned, and then two bright lights flashed in his eyes. Countless lights and shadows began to flicker wildly between his eyes. Space-time and layers of nomological laws were constantly being dissected in his eyes. Not long after, a strange place appeared in his eyes. It turns out that Fellow is hiding in the origin of the nomological laws. No wonder I couldn't find you back then, the boy said with a bitter smile. He looked a little helpless and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The problem that had been bothering him for hundreds of thousands of years was solved so easily. The area that Luo Fan was hiding in was a place that didn't exist in his thoughts. It was the origin of the nomological laws. Because he didn't think that the origin of the nomological laws existed, he naturally couldn't find the origin of the nomological laws no matter how hard he tried. Naturally, he couldn't find where Luo Fan was hiding. At this time, after communicating with Luo Fan for 100,000 years, he already knew Luo Fan's thoughts and the existence of the nomological laws in Luo Fan's mind. Therefore, he could naturally find the origin of the nomological laws. It could be said that what really shackled the boy was actually just a change of thinking. As long as he changed his thinking, then naturally, nothing could stop him. Unfortunately, even if I know, I still won't be able to find you if you hide again. After feeling helpless, the boy smiled bitterly again. Although he had already discovered the existence of the nomological laws, he would still be able to find Luo Fan the next time he hid there. However, that was only the origin of the nomological laws. Who knew if Luo Fan knew about other existences that he didn't know about? If he hid in an existence that he didn't realize existed the next time, how would he be able to find him? Isn't this very normal? Fellow Taoist can't find me, so naturally, I can't find you either. Luo Fan just smiled. When the boy heard this, a smile appeared on his face. Indeed, he was an itinerant cultivator. He had relied on himself to cultivate to this point. In his countless years of cultivation, how many strange concepts had he established? How many things that he knew that others couldn't? This was something that he still couldn't be sure of. However, he knew that there must be things that existed in his knowledge that definitely didn't exist in the knowledge of other cultivators. Obviously, if he wanted to hide, as long as he hid in it, no other cultivator would be able to detect his existence. Chapter 21-23. Although there wasn't much communication between them, the previous 100,000 years of heart-to-heart understanding had allowed Luo Fan and the boy to understand each other to a certain extent. With such a deep understanding, they already knew each other's thoughts without needing to speak much. At this moment, they didn't waste any time talking. In the time it took to say a few words, they had already separated. The 100,000 years of continuous absorption of nutrients from the third level of the Tao Master's path was a huge harvest beyond imagination for both of them. Now, what they needed to do the most was obviously to digest the previous harvest, if not for anything else. After leaving the boy, Luo Fan's figure flickered and directly arrived outside the origin of the laws on the third level of the Tao Master's path. The third level of the Tao Master's path existed in the form of heaven and earth, so it naturally had almost all the characteristics of heaven and earth. The laws of laws, time, space, matter, energy, and so on naturally existed. Similarly, the existence of many factors meant that the origin of the laws of laws in the depths of the laws of laws naturally existed. However, the heaven and earth reflected in the third level of the Tao Master's path was too grand, too deep, and too mysterious. Even the great heaven and earth seemed to be insignificant compared to the third level. Under such circumstances, the laws of the third level were naturally beyond imagination for Luo Fan. The origin of the laws of the third level was even more complicated and indescribable for him. Even though Luo Fan had come here, he couldn't comprehend the origin of the laws at will. He could only use his own worldview to interfere with the origin of the laws and barely open a gap in the origin of the laws to enter it. Of course, it would be more accurate to say that he had used his worldview of laws to interact with the origin of the natural order and gradually opened up a space-time corresponding to the worldview of laws on the origin of the natural order to accommodate himself. It could be said that the relationship between such a space-time and the origin of the laws was only a relationship that was connected to the origin of the laws. Apart from that, he couldn't obtain the slightest power from the origin of the laws, let alone use the origin of the laws of the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. In fact, it was precisely because of this that the boy was unable to discover his existence back then. After all, that boy was the ruler of the third level of the path to becoming a Tao sovereign. If Luo Fan had really changed the laws, then there would definitely be traces left behind, and it would definitely be discovered by the Overlord who was thoroughly investigating the third layer of the Tao sovereign's path. With a slight thought, Luo Fan had already sensed the location of the spacetime that he had opened up. With a single step, he had already stepped into the spacetime, disappearing from the senses of any cultivators who didn't know about the origin of the law. Of course, the boy was no longer among them. At this moment, the boy occasionally scanned the area with his senses and discovered that Luo Fan had disappeared into the origin of the natural order. An inexplicable emotion appeared on his face. However, he quickly threw all of this to the back of his mind. He still needed to spend a lot of time to digest the harvest he had gained in the past 100,000 years, so how could he have the time to care about where Luo Fan was hiding? As for the situation in the third level of the Tao Master's path, it was not a problem even if it was missing him for 100,000 years. It would not be a problem even if it was missing another 100,000 years or even millions of years, so he didn't need to care about it. His heart skipped a beat, and he slowly closed his eyes. His body began to gradually dissipate, and in the end, he completely disappeared. He entered a place that only he knew existed, and no other living being knew existed. Even Luo Fan only knew about this place when he had a heart-to-heart communication with the boy in the past 100,000 years. Apart from him, even the conspirator did not think that the place where he was hiding was real at this time. In other words, even the conspirator would not be able to discover the boy's existence at this time. At the moment when he disappeared, the conspirator's figure emerged out of thin air and stood on the void where the platform used to be. There was an inexplicable helplessness on his face. "You're the master of the third level, not me." Compared to the boy's intense reaction to Luo Fan hiding in an area that he could not find, the conspirator's reaction to the boy hiding in an area that he could not find was extremely calm. After all, although he was a Tao Master's disciple, he was just a subordinate of the boy in the third level. Even if he had some authority here, it was still a far cry from the boy's. With such a gap in strength, it was normal for the boy to think of a way to avoid his detection. It was not surprising at all. On the other hand, if the hiding place of the boy was something that he could detect, he would suspect that the boy was suspicious of him and deliberately appeared there to test his loyalty. At that moment, he sighed. He could only continue to raise the pillar of order in the third level and continue to control the various operations of the third level like he had done for the past 100,000 years. At this moment, his heart skipped a beat. He found that a creature that he had previously detected had appeared in his senses. Oh, it has reappeared? This thought came to his mind at this moment. Then, with a thought, he used the power of the third level of the Tao Master's road to directly cross an unknown distance in time and space. He directly appeared in a place that was about dozens of large worlds away from where he was originally. That place was a mountain peak. It was a mountain with an extremely wonderful cultivation environment. Every material contained an almost perfect world, and its mysteries were extraordinarily obvious. Moreover, it was a mountain that had not been discovered by any other cultivators and had not been occupied by other cultivators as a cave residence. At this moment, there was an old man looking around blankly. The moment the conspirator appeared here, the old man's eyes narrowed and revealed an inexplicable solemnity. "Don't worry, the current situation is completely different from before." Seeing the old man's expression, the conspirator smiled and said so. Hearing this, the old man slightly relaxed and said, "It seems that he really didn't lie to me. I didn't expect that the exchange that happened billions of years ago would create this opportunity for me. I wonder where you have been hiding all these years? I have investigated for a long time, but I can't find anything at all," the conspirator said to the old man with a smile. The old man was obviously the one that Luo Fan sent into the origin of the natural order, the one that had karma with him. At this moment, hearing the conspirator's question, a trace of confusion appeared in the old man's eyes, and he said, "Actually, I don't know either. Over the past 100,000 years, I seem to have entered a bizarre space. In that place, all laws were clear and there were endless laws being poured into my heart at every moment. However, those truths were all profound and unfathomable, and with my realm, I couldn't understand them at all. It wasn't until just now that he sent me out." "Oh, it's actually so mysterious?" The conspirator sighed in surprise. "Perhaps it's because my realm is not high enough." The old man sighed with an indescribable helplessness on his face. However, it was only helplessness. As for the negative emotions such as discouragement and despair, they did not appear in his eyes. After all, he was a powerful existence that had cultivated for billions of years. If he did not have this kind of mentality, he would have been unable to withstand the passage of time and collapsed countless billions of years ago. "I am now temporarily managing the entire third floor on behalf of the ruler of the third floor. I wonder if you are interested in taking up a position?" The conspirator smiled and said to the old man. Hearing this, the old man smiled bitterly and shook his head. "Forget it. For me, cultivation is more important now. Taking up a position might be beneficial to my cultivation, but it will only hold up part of my energy. The gains do not make up for the losses." The conspirator was not too surprised by the old man's decision, so he did not continue to pester him. He only spoke with the old man for a while longer and dispelled the misgivings in his heart. Then, he disappeared without a trace. After the conspirator disappeared, the old man raised his head to look at the sky of the third floor. He looked at the endless time and space that appeared in the sky. He looked at the endless truths that appeared in the endless time and space, and the endless truths he had absorbed before faintly appeared in his heart bit by bit. After a long while, he smiled in relief. With a wave of his hand, a wave of power directly enveloped the mountain. As it trembled slightly, he began to use an extremely subtle method to modify the mountain. As he modified it, a cave abode appeared on the mountain. It was tightly integrated with the mountain, causing the mountain to faintly become one. Endless truths and mysteries began to pour into the cave abode. The old man didn't hesitate when he saw this. He lifted his foot and lightly strode into the cave. He seemed to have entered into hibernation as he started to immerse himself in the numerous principles and profundities that were being condensed ceaselessly from all directions. As he entered this state, the cave abode and the mountain began to gradually disappear. In the end, it was as if a large space had suddenly been emptied. Although he did not know the essence of the origin of the law due to his lack of knowledge, he had stayed in it for 100,000 years. Even if he did not understand it, his body and will had unknowingly absorbed a lot of the characteristics of the origin of the law. At this moment, he fused these characteristics into the cave abode and the mountain, allowing the cave abode and the mountain to naturally obtain a trace of the characteristics of the origin of the law. In other words, those who did not know the origin of the law would find it difficult to discover the existence of the cave abode and the mountain. Of course, after all, it was only a trace of the characteristics. Although these characteristics existed, they could not be very powerful. Therefore, although in theory, cultivators who did not know the origin of the law would not be able to discover the existence of the cave abode and the mountain, as long as they were strong enough and had keen senses, they would eventually be able to discover the mountain and the cave abode. However, it was obvious that this was the limit of what the old man could do. It was more than enough to be used in this secluded place. Just as the old man was modifying the cave abode and the mountain, the conspirator had already arrived at another place. This was the place where many Tao masters cultivated. Don't forget, in addition to the conspirator, there were many other Tao masters who had helped the boy. The mentality of these Tao masters was actually similar to the conspirator. Although their cultivation path was not like the conspirators, they did not rely on some experts. Now that the boy had won, they could naturally enjoy the fruits of victory. At this moment, the area where they were located was actually the best cultivation place on the third level of the Tao Master's path. This was a strange spacetime, in which the void was distorted by some strange law, reflecting almost all the scenes in the third level of the Tao Master's path. Moreover, because of that distortion, the mysteries of the many nearly perfect worlds in the scene were thousands of times more obvious than before. The endless mysteries and principles intertwined, turning this spacetime into a sea of principles. The many Tao Masters were like fish swimming in the sea of principles. They were extremely comfortable and happy, immersed in it, enjoying the wonderful feeling of the mysteries being injected into their bodies every moment. For these Tao Masters, they were originally from the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. The driving force that drove them to go against the Tao Master's path to the third level was that their foundation in the third level was not solid enough. Under such circumstances, what they were doing at this time was actually to reconsolidate their foundation. Moreover, it was thousands of times more solid than before. The endless information, the endless principles, and the endless mysteries were constantly being poured into their bodies, and their essence was changing bit by bit. Although the aura of their bodies was not growing all the time, it was being stabilized all the time. The original traces of loopholes were constantly being filled and eliminated in the process. When the conspirator arrived, the many Tao Masters ignored him and were wholeheartedly immersed in that kind of comfort. Seeing this, the conspirator smiled bitterly and said, "It seems that you are not even interested in knowing what is happening outside." His words did not receive any reply. For the many Tao Masters, the answer to this question was simply obvious, and there was no need to answer it at all. The conspirator also knew what the many Tao Masters were thinking, so he immediately said, "Fellow Taoists, it is better for you to listen. This time, there is a great opportunity waiting for you to seize." Hearing this, most of the Tao Masters ignored him, and were wholeheartedly immersed in the sea of information, mysteries, and principles. But there were also a small number of Tao Masters who opened their eyes and turned to look at the conspirator curiously. However, this was only an extremely small portion of them, and the total number was less than 20. However, for the conspirator, this was clearly enough. Obviously, he did not intend to let all the Tao Masters join him. As long as a few Tao Masters were willing to join, it was enough to be successful. Immediately, he said to the dozens of Tao Masters, "This time there are some changes in the entire third level, and a large part of the authority will not be controlled. This is an opportunity for you. If you can get that authority, you will be able to control a large part of the third level. At that time, your cultivation will be more convenient, and you will even be able to get a lot of merit." Hearing this, half of the dozens of Tao Masters directly closed their eyes and continued to be immersed in their original cultivation, as if they had heard nothing. Only the remaining 8 Tao Masters were still interested. One of the Tao Masters asked, "Getting that authority will take up our energy. The price we pay is obviously not proportional to the benefits we get. I don't think this is an opportunity." The conspirator just smiled and said, "That's why you don't know how much the situation in the third level has changed. The third level today is different from before. Now the benefits of obtaining authority are countless times greater than before. If you don't believe me, you can follow me to have a look." Hearing this, the hearts of the 8 Tao Masters were moved. The fact that they were able to listen until now meant that they were rather interested in this matter. Now that they were encouraged by the conspirator, they were finally tempted. Anyway, even if it was different from what he said, in the end, it was just a waste of time. Compared to the benefits that could be obtained, it was obviously worth wasting a little time. Immediately, the 8 Tao Masters all stood up, lifted a step, and lightly stepped to the side of the conspirator, saying, "Then let's have a look." Hearing this, the conspirator was overjoyed and said with a smile, you will never regret it. With that, he opened the passage to the outside world and took the 8 of them out of this spacetime. Put the cart before the horse. At this moment, a Tao Master's disciple among the many Tao Masters spat out these words. Obviously, he did not agree with the actions of the 8 Tao Masters. Chapter 21-24. For these disciples of Tao Masters, they still had the arrogance of being disciples of Tao Masters. Even if they were actually helping the rogue cultivator and betraying the Taoist Masters sect, they still couldn't change their arrogance that came from within. With such arrogance, it was clear that they didn't think much of the boy in the depths of their hearts. With such a mentality, they were quite disdainful of honestly helping that boy, working for that boy, and taking on that boy's authority in exchange for some benefits that the boy left behind. To them, they had helped the boy in exchange for such an excellent cultivation environment. This was the end of their entanglement with the boy. What they needed to do next was to put all of this behind them and work hard to cultivate and strengthen their foundations. Finally, they could ascend to the Tao of immortality in a more perfect state, or even further, to the Tao of 5th level or even 6th level, which they had never dared to look forward to before. Under such circumstances, seeing that the other disciples of the Tao Masters were attracted by the boy's authority and eventually wasted their own cultivation time to help the boy manage the entire 3rd level of the Tao Master path, how could these disciples not think that they were putting the cart before the horse? How could they not think that the other disciples of the Tao Masters had lost the correct will to cultivate? After the disdainful sneer, those disciples of the Tao Masters once again immersed themselves in the state of cultivation. At this time, the void fell back into its original state of silence, as if nothing had happened before. Although the conspirator did not see the views of the many boys with his own eyes, he could guess it. However, he did not care about this at all. When he had dared to abandon his own camp to help the boy, he had already made up his mind to put all the outsiders' opinions behind him. For him, he did not care even if all the Tao Masters and all the cultivators of the Tao Masters despised him, let alone a few disciples of the Tao Masters. Not to mention that the opinions of those disciples of the Tao Masters were extremely pedantic and could even be called stupid. Under such circumstances, he naturally did not care about what those disciples of the Tao Masters thought. At this time, he led the 8 Tao Masters and used the authority granted to him by the boy to flash around the 3rd level of the Tao Masters path. In the blink of an eye, he left the 8 Tao Masters in a certain area and gave them some kind of authority, allowing them to control a certain kind of authority in a large area and sharing the pressure of managing the 3rd level of the Tao Masters path. After a few times, he distributed the 8 types of authority that brought him the greatest burden. In the end, he felt his body lighten, as if a boundless burden had been lifted. As expected, authority can bring great benefits. A certain Tao Master's disciple, who had been placed by the conspirator to assume some kind of authority on the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path, muttered with inexplicable joy in his eyes. At this time, his body seemed to be connected with the entire 3rd level of the Tao Master's path. The nomological law of the 3rd level was operating and seemed to have regarded his body as a node. Endless information and truths were constantly flowing through his body and mind, although there was not much left and was absorbed by him. However, just the scouring traces of the information flow had already brought him great benefits, making him feel that his cultivation realm was growing at every moment. Moreover, the speed of his growth was many times faster than when he was cultivating in the void, where the environment for cultivation was excellent. Obviously, he was not the only one who had this feeling. In fact, the 8 Tao Masters' disciples who had been separated all had the same feeling. In fact, because they had all received the authority of the 3rd floor, they could be considered colleagues to a certain extent. Although the 8 of them were scattered across the 3rd floor and were far away from each other, they could communicate with each other through the connection of authority, understand each other's thoughts, and understand each other's situation for a moment, they all understood each other's changes and could not help but feel inexplicable joy in their hearts. They were glad that they had made this choice under the contempt of the many Tao masters. If they did not make this choice, they would still be frogs at the bottom of a well, only guarding their own small world, not knowing how wide the world was. As for whether or not the 8 Tao masters were satisfied with the benefits brought about by the power, the conspirator did not have the slightest doubt. If such benefits were not enough to satisfy them, then he could not think of any benefits that could satisfy them. At this time, after distributing part of his authority, the conspirator came to a node of the 3rd level and began to sit cross-legged. His figure gradually disappeared. As he disappeared, an indescribable wave began to spread in all directions from his original position, gradually sweeping over every inch of the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path. In an extremely fierce and swift manner, it had already swept through the entire 3rd level of the Tao Master's path in a very short period of time, including every inch of the 3rd level of the space-time and every inch of the world into the wave. Wisp by wisp, information gathered towards the source of the fluctuation and was gradually absorbed into the source of the fluctuation. In other words, it was absorbed into the heart of the conspirator. With this change, the conspirator's understanding of the entire 3rd level deepened at every moment. The mysteries of the 3rd level were also revealed in front of him bit by bit. In this process, he felt that his cultivation level, which had not been seen for a long time, began to increase again. From this appearance, it was clear that the conspirator had also fallen into a state of cultivation. As the conspirator fell into a state of cultivation, the situation of the entire 3rd level of the Tao Master's path became more and more stable. The adjustments that the conspirator might have made disappeared. The entire 3rd level of the Tao Master's path seemed to have fallen into a stable and unchanging stage. During this process, time slowly passed. 1,000,000 years passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, the laws of the 3rd level began to produce some kind of vibration that no cultivator in the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path could understand. This vibration was so strong and so obvious that it even made people feel as if there was an invisible hand stirring the laws of the 3rd level. Such a strange change immediately awakened many authority holders in the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path. In other words, the boy, the conspirator, and the many cultivators who had been given authority by the conspirator. The disciples of the 8 Tao Masters with the highest authority also woke up under the appearance of this strange fluctuation and left the state of cultivation. What's going on? The conspirator's eyes were a little dazed and vigilant. This change almost covered every inch of the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path and affected every strand of power. It had completely destroyed the perfect cultivation environment that he had originally obtained with the help of his authority. It made it difficult for him to sink into the state of cultivation again. The feeling of having one's cultivation state broken was naturally depressing. Even a scheming schemer like this one could not help but feel depressed at this moment. At this moment, he sensed that an extremely powerful existence had appeared in his senses and began to suppress the changes on the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path and quickly restore the cultivation environment that had been destroyed by the vibration. At this moment, he knew that the powerful existence was none other than the target he had attached himself to, the boy who was the ruler of the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path. After learning that the boy had reappeared, he did not dare to be careless. With a single thought, his body flickered and he passed through the supreme power of the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path. He traversed the endless space-time and arrived before the boy. At this moment, the boy seemed to become more and more unfathomable to him. In the past, he could barely detect the other party's limit and knew that the other party was tens of thousands of times stronger than him. But now, facing the boy, he had no idea how much stronger the other party was. The multiplier was 1 digit, 2 digits, 3 digits, 4 digits, 5 digits, 6 digits, or even more. He could not sense it at all. I wonder what kind of power this is. Will it cause damage to the third level? The conspirator asked after appearing in front of the boy. Hearing this, the boy's expression was a little inexplicable. He seemed to be in disbelief, a little enlightened, and an inexplicable sense of loss. I already know who did it, but you don't have to worry about the third level being damaged. When the conspirator heard this, he suddenly came to a realization. In the third level, perhaps only that powerhouse could make this boy reveal such complicated emotions. I see. He murmured with inexplicable shock in his eyes. It was precisely because he understood what kind of existence caused all of this that he was even more shocked and incredulous. After all, it seemed that it had only been 1,000,000 years since he last saw that existence. At that time, it would take a great deal of energy and effort for that existence to change the environment of a certain area, let alone affect the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. But now, in just a short period of 1,000,000 years, that existence could actually use a random method that he did not understand to cause the entire third level to shake and affect the entire third level. Even if he had already made up his mind, he couldn't help but be a little shaken at this time. The conspirator did not know the existence of the origin of the law, so even if he guessed that the one who caused the entire third level to shake was Luo Fan, he couldn't find the existence of Luo Fan no matter what. He couldn't even sense the source of the shaking. In contrast, the boy who knew about the existence of the origin of the law through his communication with Luo Fan was obviously different. He had already seen the figure that was walking out of the depths of the origin of the law step by step on the origin of the law. The figure that belonged to Luo Fan. He saw that the current Luo Fan was already a world of difference compared to the last time he met him. Back then, although Luo Fan was unparalleled, he could still barely sense the depth of Luo Fan's strength. He had the confidence that even if he couldn't defeat Luo Fan, he could definitely make Luo Fan suffer a big loss. But now, looking at Luo Fan, he found that he couldn't grasp the person in front of him at all. He couldn't even touch Luo Fan. It felt like no matter how much strength he used, how much effort he spent, and how much price he paid, he couldn't affect Yi Shiwen in the slightest. It was impossible to touch Yi Shiwen's bottom line. I didn't expect that the gap would increase to this extent in just 1,000,000 years. The boy's eyes revealed an indescribable complex emotion as he thought to himself. At this time, Luo Fan completely ignored the others. At this moment, he was walking out of the origin of the law on the third level of the Tao Master's road step by step into the normal space-time of the third level of the Tao Master's road. His figure gradually stepped out of the illusion and gradually emerged between heaven and earth. Every step he took was on the node of the origin of the law, and the node trembled slightly with his movements. Every tremble was constantly transmitted through the connection between the origin of the law and the infinite laws. It spread throughout the endless space-time of the third level of the Tao Master's road and all the almost perfect heaven and earth. At this time, there was only an inexplicable expression on Luo Fan's face. There seemed to be some joy in his expression, but also a little confusion. 3,000 years. He stood in the void and looked up at the sky. His eyes seemed to penetrate all obstacles and shone on a certain place in the state of chaos. Such a thought flashed in his mind. 3,000 years. This wasn't some random number. It was precisely the time he sensed that his fifth great tribulation was about to descend. That's right, after all these years of cultivation, his cultivation realm had made great progress. Now, he could accurately grasp the time when the major tribulation would arrive. At this time, his heart was filled with an indescribable sense of crisis and an indescribable sense of anticipation. The sense of crisis came from the terrifying danger of the fifth major tribulation, and the sense of anticipation came from the meaning of the arrival of the fifth major tribulation. He sensed the precise time when the fifth major tribulation would arrive, which meant that his cultivation realm had been raised to a high enough level to grasp the subtle changes of the major tribulation. This meant that he had taken another step forward from the true saint realm. At this moment, the third level of the Tao Master's road no longer looked as unfathomable as before. In his eyes, this place had become a step, or rather a threshold. A step to a higher level, a threshold to step into a whole new world. This invisible step and threshold appeared in the void. It seemed that he could cross it with just one step, but it also seemed that no matter how hard he tried, he could not touch it. At this time, he had an epiphany. This was the ascension rules of the third level. Now, as long as he was willing, he could trigger the ascension rules at any time, step onto the step, leave the third level, and step into a higher level. So, this is what the ascension rules look like. This thought appeared in his mind at this moment. Given his strength, he had long possessed all his power on the third level of the Tao Master's road. With all his strength, he could trigger the ascension rules at any time and ascend to the fourth level. However, it was only at this moment that he was able to clearly see what the ascension rules were like. In other words, it was only now that he had truly grasped the foundation of the third level of the Tao Master's road and was truly qualified to touch the essence of the Tao Master's road. With a slight thought, he raised his hand and stretched towards the void. In his own eyes, his hand was very ordinary as it stretched towards the step and threshold that represented the ascension rules, and slowly touched the step. However, in the eyes of the outside world, his hand was unimaginably mysterious. The hand seemed to gradually turn into nothingness. When it finally straightened, the hand seemed to have completely disappeared, as if it had reached into the depths of the void to touch an unimaginably supreme existence. All the cultivators who saw this suddenly felt that the hand seemed to have grasped their life and death, grasped their everything. It seemed that as long as the hand was willing, they would not be able to resist at all and would be thrown to any place the hand wanted. Whether it was the schemer or the boy, both of them had the same feeling at this moment. What's going on? I've clearly become the master of the third level. Who else in the third level can make me feel this way? This thought flashed through the boy's mind at this moment, and the light in his eyes began to flicker continuously. Only now did he realize that although he seemed to have completely mastered the third level of the Tao Master's road, in fact, he had only touched the surface. There were even more, deeper, and even more inconceivable mysteries waiting for him to explore, to understand, and to control. How did he do it? With this thought, a doubt flashed through the boy's mind. Chapter 21-25. Obviously, Luo Fan did not care about the doubts in the hearts of the other living beings. At this moment, his heart stirred slightly. He carefully sensed the unique subtle pulse of the ascension rules of the Tao Master's path in his hand, and felt the infinite and vast aura contained within it. At this moment, he vaguely saw that there were more steps below this step. As long as he was willing, he could step onto the next step, or even several steps, at any time. In an instant, he understood in his heart. These were the second and first levels of the Tao Master's path. As long as he stepped onto the steps below, he would naturally be able to step directly into the second or even the first level. Moreover, he was absolutely sure that even if he stepped onto the second or first level, he would not encounter the Tao Master's prison that other cultivators would inevitably encounter when returning from the third level to the first two levels, because this was allowed by the Tao Master's path. After all, if he stepped onto the first two levels now, he would not be taking advantage of some loophole in the Tao Master's path or some imperfection of the Tao Master's path to return. Instead, he would be relying on himself to understand the essence of the Tao Master's path, and relying on himself to dig out the deeper mysteries of the Tao Master's path. If the former was said to be stealing, then he was now the true owner of the Tao Master's path, and directly taking it. The difference between the two was self-evident. Luo Fan stood there quietly with an indescribable expression on his face. His heart was filled with an indescribable joy. Then, he raised his head and looked up at the top of the step. There was an indescribable light above the step. It was a color that could not be described with words, and even more so, it was a mysterious light that could not be described with words. This kind of light filled the world and covered everything else, making it impossible for him to see clearly or see through anything. Not to mention the possibility that there might be a higher step. At this moment, he understood that the light represented the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. The reason why he could only see the endless light was very simple. It was because he had not yet stepped onto the fourth level, nor could he see through it. He did not know what the essence of the fourth level was. This was just like the third level he had seen before. Sure enough, the road to becoming a Tao Master is not so simple. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Even if he had seen through the Tao Master's path, and had even clearly manifested the ascension rules of the Tao Master's path, his understanding of the Tao Master's path was still insignificant. The mysteries hidden beyond his understanding were still endless, waiting for him to explore and absorb. Upon discovering this, he was both a little disappointed and a little delighted. Naturally, he was disappointed because there were things that he could not understand. He still could not see the truth of certain things. For someone like him who wanted to understand and control everything, this was naturally disappointing. However, at the same time, such a change also meant that he could still obtain endless benefits from this place. He could still comprehend many principles that he could not comprehend in the past. This was naturally something to be happy about. With all kinds of thoughts flashing in his mind, Luo Fan slowly withdrew his palm. As he withdrew his palm, the pulsation that belonged to the ascension rules of the Tao Master's path, that was constantly transmitted from his hand, was suddenly cut off. The indescribable vastness and mystery had greatly weakened. Of course, this did not mean that the steps in his eyes would disappear because of this. In fact, because of his previous gains, he felt that he could see the steps more clearly and intuitively. At this moment, he came back to his senses and turned to look at where the boy was. His eyes pierced through the endless space and time, illuminating all obstructions. He saw where the boy was, who knew how many worlds away from him, and his gaze met with the boy's. The two of them were separated by an unknown amount of space and time, and they stared at each other. After seeing the boy, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "I'm really sorry to have disturbed you, Taoist friend." Hearing this, the boy smiled bitterly. At present, the distance between him and Luo Fan was obviously beyond the range that a normal cultivator at this level could detect. He could see Luo Fan and grasp all the changes in that position because he relied on his authority in the third level of the Tao Master's path. In other words, he relied on the power of the third level itself, the power itself. However, at this time, when he found that Luo Fan could also see, hear, and talk to him through the infinite distance and the infinite spacetime, he found that he was not surprised at all. Instead, he felt that this was a matter of course, as if this situation should have happened in the first place. Yi Futian should be able to do something that was impossible for a normal cultivator at this level. The emergence of this mentality obviously meant that in his heart, Luo Fan had already risen to a position that was almost omnipotent. If this appeared in the heart of an ordinary cultivator, it would be extremely normal. However, it appeared in front of him, a rogue cultivator who had become the ruler of the third level of the Tao Master's path, and even surpassed all the other disciples of the Tao Masters. This was obviously an incredible thing. Every time I see you, Taoist friend, I feel like my cultivation is simply a dog's body. The boy sighed, and there was an inexplicable sense of loss in his eyes. This sense of loss was inexplicably familiar to him, as if he had seen it too many times. His heart trembled slightly, and he knew that his feeling was not wrong. He had indeed seen this kind of loss too many times. However, He had seen this kind of loss in the past on other people, and it was because of him. Now it was the other way around, and it appeared in his heart, and it was because of him. Every dog has its day. I wonder when I can see this kind of loss in him? The boy sighed, and some inexplicable thoughts flashed through his mind. However, it was obvious that he could not say this out loud at this time. Therefore, he only had an inexplicable strange expression on his face. Hearing the boy's words, Luo Fan only smiled. As for the strange expression on the boy's face, although he did not know what it meant, he knew that it was definitely not a congratulatory thought. However, at this time, he clearly did not have the mood to find out what the boy was thinking. He only smiled slightly and said, "It's just a coincidence. Compared to Taoist friend, this little achievement is nothing." As he spoke, the space-time around Luo Fan's body shook slightly, and it seemed to make his figure somewhat blurry. Seeing this, the boy's expression changed slightly. This kind of behavior, it was obvious that he was gradually going to transcend the third level. He had never seen this kind of situation from any other cultivator, and he did not even know that this kind of situation existed. Noticing the changes in his body, Luo Fan smiled bitterly and said, "As expected, I'm already close to my limit here. If I'm not careful and don't completely suppress it, I'll be instantly expelled from the third level." The boy's face was inexplicably envious as he said, "I didn't expect such a change. This time, my eyes have really been opened." Luo Fan only smiled and said, "In this situation, I don't have much time to chat with Taoist friend. Take care, Taoist friend." As he spoke, his body shook, and he had already disappeared from all of the boy's detection methods. It was as if he had already left the third level of the Tao Master's path in an instant. However, the boy obviously did not think so. If he had left just like that, why would he have suppressed himself to stay here? Since he had suppressed himself before, it was obvious that he would not completely give up just because he met Yi Qingyu. Under such circumstances, there was obviously only one possibility, that he could not see Yi Qingyu. Yi Qingyu had once again used some unimaginable method to hide from Yi Qingyu's perception and detection, making it impossible for Yi Qingyu to discover his existence. An inexplicable frustration emerged in the boy's heart at this moment. This was not the first time that Luo Fan was unable to probe the other party. For him, who had always been almost invincible, the sense of frustration was self-evident. What's the point of competing with him? I'm really looking for trouble. After letting out a sigh, his figure flickered, and he disappeared once again, hiding in a place that only he knew existed. With his disappearance, the third level of the Tao Master's path seemed to return to its original state, as if nothing had happened. What the hell is going on? Why did such a change happen just now? Did the ruler achieve some kind of breakthrough? A Tao Master's disciple who controlled a certain kind of authority on the third level of the Tao Master's path asked the conspirator in bewilderment. The other Tao Master's disciples also chimed in at this moment, wanting to find out what exactly happened and how it would affect their future. The schemer could only laugh bitterly at this sort of prying. It wasn't a ruler. It was another expert. Who? The Tao Master's disciples asked in bewilderment. Their expressions were inexplicably bewildered. Hearing this, the conspirator sighed and said, "Can't you guess? Or do you not dare to believe it at all?" The Tao Master's disciples were slightly stunned, and then they all smiled bitterly. Indeed, apart from the independent cultivator who dared to fight against the ruler, who else could it be? Compared to the boy's shock, the Tao Master's disciples who were just as knowledgeable were also extremely shocked. The independent cultivator was already so strong that it was completely unreasonable, and now he was even more powerful. How could they live? Luo Fan paid no attention to the shock and disbelief of the many cultivators at this moment. He was only 3,000 years away from the next great tribulation. This amount of time was so short that it could not even be compared to the blink of an eye for existences at his level. How could he not make the best use of such a short time to prepare? After all, it was the fifth great tribulation. The degree of danger could only be stronger than the fourth great tribulation, not weaker. He couldn't be any more aware of how dangerous the fourth tribulation was. The fifth great tribulation was even more dangerous than the fourth, and it went without saying how dangerous it was. How could he not be careful? At this moment, he was still on the third level of the Tao Master's path. However, he did not stay in a certain place to cultivate and wait. Instead, he began to walk on the third level. Outside of the boy's detection range, his figure constantly flickered. Every time he flickered, he seemed to have crossed the furthest distance of a great world. If it was calculated according to distance, it would probably be billions of light-years away. Although he had been cultivating on the third level of the road of Tao Master for a long time, and had even participated in the great changes of the entire road of Tao Master, the distance he had walked on the third level was not considered much since he entered it. It could even be said to be very few. He was very clear about the mysteries and inconceivable principles of the third level. However, he had not seen many mysteries and principles with his own eyes. At this time, taking advantage of the time before the fifth great tribulation arrived, he was ready to see the many wonderful sights of the third level with his own eyes. He wanted to see the endless things that were helpful to cultivation. In addition to increasing his own knowledge, the most important thing was to prepare for the fifth great tribulation. After the third level of the Tao Master's path was completed, the number of places that were similar to the valley where he had obtained the foundation of the law attainment had increased by at least 100 times. There were quite a few cultivation grounds that were even better than the valley he had been in before. After the distance was no longer a limit, Luo Fan did not intend to give up any of the cultivation holy places. Therefore, in the next 3,000 years, Luo Fan left his mark in every cultivation holy place. For him, the quintessence and origin of every cultivation holy place were like an open warehouse, allowing him to use them at will. Every time he entered a cultivation holy place, he would use the fastest time possible. It could be a few years, a few days, or even a few breaths, to obtain the true secrets of the cultivation holy place. After obtaining those secrets, he directly used the foundation of the law attainment that he had condensed at the beginning to fuse those secrets into it, and gradually changed the foundation of the law attainment. The foundation of the law attainment itself was a great world that was taking shape, but could never be formed. More and more secrets, more and more mysteries, quintessence, and origin of the cultivation holy places were integrated into it. This was to constantly push the foundation of the law attainment towards the great world, allowing it to get closer and closer to the great world. Of course, no matter how close it got, the fundamental limit was that it could not really reach the level of the great world. However, although it could not truly reach the great world, every time it got a little closer to the great world, the mysteries and principles within it would become thousands of times more profound. In other words, every time the foundation of the law attainment moved a little closer to the great world, the benefits that Luo Fan could obtain would increase by thousands of times. To him, there was no need to explain how great the benefits were. It could be said that every time he passed by a cultivation holy place, the conditions for his future cultivation would increase by several times. Just like that, when the 3,000 years were about to pass, the foundation of the law attainment in his hand had already grown into something completely different from before. At this moment, the foundation of the law attainment had turned into a human figure. A figure was lying in the void. It was faintly discernible, and there were countless space and time surging inside it. Boundless heaven and earth flickered, and endless principles were constantly being born, dying, being created, and being destroyed. The figure's face was blurry, and it looked a little like Luo Fan, but it was also fundamentally different. The figure was not very big, only the size of a palm. As it lay on top of Luo Fan's palm, It was like a brand new image was being projected from his palm. Within the silhouette, one could find a world view that was evolving. It was a world view that was constantly being constructed, crumbled, and reconstructed, and one could also see that the endless worlds of other worlds were connecting, complementing, promoting and clashing with each other, forming an indescribable balance as a whole. This dynamic balance was also the reason why the foundation of the law attainment was still the foundation of the law attainment. When this dynamic balance disappeared and was replaced by a stable balance, that is, when all the worldviews merged into a whole and became a real worldview on the level of the great heaven and earth, this foundation would no longer be the foundation of the great heaven and earth. Instead, it would truly become the embryonic form of the great heaven and earth. At that time, the great world would naturally break away from Luo Fan's control. It might even break away from the Tao Master path and the great world of the Tao Master. It would enter a state of chaos and become another world within the state of chaos. It would be a great world that was waiting for the baptism of the great tribulation of the world to become truly eternal. Of course, this was only a theoretical development prospect. In reality, the foundation of the law attainment was the foundation for the development of something in the third level of the Tao Master path. However, it could not reach the final stage and truly form the worldview of the great world. Naturally, it could not truly form the prototype of a great world, break away from Luo Fuan's control, break away from the Tao Master path, and become a great world of the Tao Master. Chapter 21-26. Over the years, Luo Fan had relied on the various cultivation holy lands on the third level of the Tao Master's path. He had combined the endless principles and mysteries within it to condense the item that could only be the foundation of achieving the Tao into something between a divine sense and a magic treasure. The best experience of reading novels is here. This item was mysterious and wonderful. It was both tangible and illusory at the same time. It also had the various magical effects of the foundation of achieving the Tao. Moreover, because it contained the various mysteries of the cultivation holy lands, the magical effects of assisting cultivation had become even more powerful and wonderful. However, after Luo Fan had condensed it over the years, it already contained the power of a primordial origin spiritual treasure. At this moment, in his hands, this item could even unleash a power that surpassed his own by a level. In other words, as long as Luo Fan wanted to, he could even use this item to easily crush all existences on the third level of the Tao Master's path. Even the boy who was originally the ruler of the third level of the Tao Master's path would be the same. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan had little interest in crushing those cultivators. At this time, his attention was on the fifth tribulation that could descend at any time above the void. This fifth tribulation was looming, and the degree of danger was sometimes high and sometimes low. The pressure it brought to him was also sometimes strong and sometimes weak, giving him a very strange feeling. It was as if an extremely powerful cultivator was confronting him, looking for his flaws, and could launch a fatal blow at any time. Let me see what mysteries the fifth tribulation has. Luo Fan quietly looked at the sky, and such thoughts flashed through his mind. Then, with a slight movement of his heart, a figure walked out of his body and directly stepped into the figure that seemed to be lying on its side in his hand. The figure that walked out of his body was extremely mysterious, and it revealed an extremely strong aura that belonged to the worldview of laws. In addition to this aura, there was also an eternal and inextinguishable aura that was much stronger than before. It was as if it was a supreme Tao Master, a supreme true saint, that came from the state of chaos. That was none other than his worldview. However, at this moment, his view of the world had undergone a huge change compared to before. At this moment, the worldview looked almost the same as the real him. Although the changes of light and darkness still existed, they were already extremely weak, or at least looked extremely weak. It was as if all the concepts within the world had merged into one, and all the concepts had been developed to the same level. The instant the figure entered the figure lying on the side, the figure that was originally only the size of a palm began to rapidly expand. In the blink of an eye, it had already surpassed its original size and expanded to a length of 10,000 feet. Lying on the side, it was like a mountain range. This was naturally an insignificant change compared to the third level of the Tao Master's path. Not to mention the third level itself, it could even be considered insignificant compared to any of the substances in it. After all, everything in the third level contained an almost perfect world. It possessed almost infinite space and time. A distance of 10,000 feet was obviously an insignificant existence for any part of the world and any spacetime. However, although it was insignificant compared to any of the substances in the third level itself, with the change, an earth-shattering chi power began to be released from it. This kind of aura belonged to a part of Luofen, but more than that, it was a kind of aura that surpassed Luofan's. It belonged to a higher and more powerful existence. Just by sensing this chi power, it was as if a wisp of the true saint's chi power had been intercepted. The entire third level of the Tao Master's path began to tremble slightly during this process. Faintly, there was some kind of wonderful fluctuation born out of thin air in various parts of the third level of the Tao Master's path. It began to constantly spread in all directions, and finally gradually linked together to form a boundless sea of fluctuations. This change did not seem to be formed by the spread of the chi power. On the contrary, it seemed that the third level of the Tao Master's path had naturally produced some kind of change in response to the emergence of this chi power. At this moment, a kind of incomparably terrifying chi power flashed by. Under this chi power, the chi power that had caused the entire third level of the Tao Master's path to change completely disappeared in an instant. Along with the chi power, the 10,000 feet tall figure lying on its side, and the body of Luofan, who was standing only a few feet in front of the figure, disappeared as well. Where did he go? As the ruler of the third level of the Tao Master's path, a look of horror appeared on the boy's face at this time. He began to use his perception to sweep every corner of the entire third level of the Tao Master's path to find the source of this upheaval, which was the existence of Luo Fan. Originally, the situation where Luo Fan had left his perception and he could not locate him at all should have been considered a natural change for the boy, and he was even a little numb to it. He did not sense Luo Fan's existence, so he should not be a little surprised. However, as the ruler of the third level, the moment Luo Fan disappeared this time, he knew that the situation this time was completely different from any previous times. This time, Luo Fan's disappearance was not of his own will at all, but the result of some kind of force that he could not understand at all. This situation made him, who had established a good relationship with Luo Fan, feel inexplicably worried. At the same time, an indescribable sense of humiliation emerged from the bottom of his heart. Since when did the third level of the Tao Master's path become a public toilet? What kind of force can come and go as it pleases? Due to this humiliation and worry, this time, the power of his thorough investigation was unprecedentedly strong. Not only did he sweep through all the places that he knew existed, but he also swept through the various places that he had previously confirmed through Luo Fan, such as the origin of the rules, and the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. However, no matter how hard he searched, and how hard he tried, he could not find any trace of Luo Fan's existence. It was as if there had never been an expert like Luo Fan in the third level of the Tao Master's path, let alone the existence of the individual cultivator who could communicate with this boy. Where did he go? He murmured, his eyes a little dazed. At this time, his heart skipped a beat. He felt that the conspirator was coming towards him. He immediately understood that the conspirator had something to say. With a pull of his hand, the conspirator, who originally needed a few breaths to rush over, instantly crossed time and space, and appeared in front of him. "Do you know something?" The boy did not ask what the conspirator wanted to say, but asked directly. After all, the conspirator was not a fool. Naturally, he knew what the boy would think if he appeared here at this time. Since he dared to appear here, it showed that he was extremely clear about what the boy wanted to know. "I may know where he is," the conspirator said to the boy at this time. Hearing this, the boy was shocked and said, "Where is he?" "He cultivates the path of retrogression. This thing is full of tribulations. I'm afraid he has already encountered another tribulation." The conspirator sighed at this time. At this moment, there was a sigh in his heart, with regret and a deep sense of pity. Originally, he was quite optimistic about Luo Fan and thought that he was very likely to become a Tao master. At least, the probability was much higher than that of cultivators like them. However, he did not expect that Luo Fan would go so far on the path of retrogression. Judging from the terrifying aura before the tribulation broke out this time, it was obvious that this tribulation was not what Luo Fan had encountered. It was the first tribulation that the path of retrogression would inevitably encounter. It might not even be the second, but the third in this case. It also meant that he had accumulated a lot of bad habits and could not turn back. If he had not encountered a tribulation, his foundation would not be stable, and there was still a great chance for him to turn back to the right path. However, once he encountered a tribulation and obtained the benefits contained in it, then his foundation would be completely fixed. No matter how powerful the divine sense, how powerful the power, or even if he became a Tao master, it would be difficult for him to change his path of cultivation. In other words, now, in his eyes, Luo Fan had no future, and the opportunity to become a Tao master had completely disappeared. How could the conspirator, who was originally very optimistic about Luo Fan, not feel regret and pity? Tribulation. The boy could not help but sigh at this time. I didn't expect that there would be such a tribulation. Moreover, its power is so strong that even I have no confidence in holding on for long. At this time, there was also regret and pity in his expression, and even an inexplicable sadness. Luo Fan naturally did not care about the various discussions that the boy and the conspirator had about him. At this moment, he had already arrived at an indescribable place. There seemed to be infinite things around here, endless light and shadow, as if endless space-time overlapped, superimposed, or just some kind of special movement of a pure thing. In this indescribable place, an overwhelming evil chi filled the void, filling all the areas that he could sense. Various kinds of terrifying and unparalleled pressure constantly descended from the void, constantly pressing down on him, and enveloping all the areas that he could sense. At this time, the figure that he had condensed, which seemed to be a magic treasure and a divine sense, stood beside him. The figure's face was blurry, and it was constantly trembling and squirming. It was as if it was constantly changing its appearance and posture, as if it was trying to stabilize a certain form, but it was unable to do so, and it was difficult for it to truly take shape. However, although the face was blurred, the aura that it released did not weaken at all. At this time, it blotted out the sky and covered the earth, directly pushing away the terrifying pressure from the endless baleful aura above. It also pushed away the ever-changing light and shadow that seemed to be formed from billions of overlapping spacetime, causing a rare small vacuum to appear around it and Luo Fan. At this moment, the countless light and shadow in the surroundings began to surge. A wisp of aura that far surpassed the aura released by the blurred figure appeared out of nowhere, instantly suppressing the powerful aura. In an instant, Luo Fan felt the figure that was both a divine sense and a magic treasure tremble slightly, and its aura was completely crushed. The figure itself also endured unimaginably terrifying pressure, and in an instant, it was pressed into Luo Fan's body, brazenly fusing with his body, forming some kind of subtle light and shadow that barely protected its body. At this moment, an indescribable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. It was a little dazed and a little lost. At this moment, Endless evil chi surged down, directly blasting into the endless light and shadow below. In an instant, the light and shadow collapsed and exploded. Terrifying shock waves were continuously produced, and continuously dissipated. In an instant, the scene around Luo Fan's body turned into something that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with. It was gray, as if it was in a state of chaos. At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if he had truly entered a state of chaos. His perception of the outside world, and even his perception of himself, was rapidly disappearing. As for his power, his body, his worldview, and even the magic treasure that had fused with him, that was both a magic treasure and a divine sense, were continuously collapsing and being annihilated in this process. They were constantly assimilated and corroded by everything in the surroundings. Not good. At this moment, such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, he frantically urged his worldview, and with the help of this worldview, he continuously urged the magic treasure that was both a divine sense and a divine sense. As he urged it, the subtle shadow that covered the surface of his body began to strengthen rapidly. It gradually emitted a more and more intense light, and its power also became more and more powerful. His resistance to everything in the outside world began to increase, allowing him to finally regain his various senses bit by bit. However, it was obvious that this was not a simple matter. During this entire process, he felt as if he was enduring the impact of an unknown number of trillions of worlds at every single moment. It seemed as if the pain and pressure at every single instant were already approaching his limits. He had a feeling that if he were to relax even a little, he would be completely assimilated and devoured by the chaos in the surroundings. Luo Fan had seen the simulated state of chaos and other states that were similar to the state of chaos countless times. It was so much so that the most direct and easiest to come into contact with was the existence in the gap between the world and the state of chaos. In fact, it already had many characteristics of the state of chaos. However, no matter where he had come into contact with it in the past, the simulated state of chaos, even if it was the state of chaos simulated by the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, seemed insignificant compared to the gray state that appeared around Luo Fan's body at this moment. Back then, the simulated state of chaos, even if it was the one simulated by the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, had traces of imitations, and one could tell that it wasn't the true state of chaos. But now, Luo Fan clearly knew that this was the manifestation of his fifth tribulation, but he couldn't see any flaws in it. This place seemed to be the true state of chaos, and everything here seemed to be a part of the state of chaos that could be extracted from the state of chaos here. All sorts of sensations, pain, and pressure that he had felt when he entered the state of chaos with the help of his clone swarmed over. Furthermore, it was more painful, more dangerous, and more terrifying than when he had sensed it with his clone. When he shifted his perspective to the conceptual level, he discovered that the changes in the conceptual level weren't much different from the changes in reality. His concept of existence was also being impacted and crushed by the strange state of chaos around him. Vaguely, it felt like it couldn't hold on any longer and was about to collapse. Luo Fan's concept of existence had been enhanced and tempered time and time again, and it had now turned into the appearance of the world of laws. In other words, it was the appearance of his true body. At this moment, under the corrosive impact of the strange and dusky concepts, his concept of existence was being corroded and assimilated at the same time as his true body, gradually melting in the dusky. There must be a flaw. This tribulation definitely has something to do with me. This thought constantly flickered in Luo Fan's mind. It was this thought that supported him to constantly search the surroundings for any possible flaws. This place definitely couldn't be the true state of chaos. This place must only be his fifth tribulation. Since it couldn't be the true state of chaos, then there must be something that wasn't the state of chaos. In other words, there must be a flaw that the normal state of chaos didn't have. And this was where his hope lay. as long as he could seize the many loopholes that might exist before he completely perished, he would be able to turn this dangerous situation around, escape, and even break through this calamity. Chapter 21-27. After all, a tribulation was just a tribulation. It was not the wrath of the heavens, nor was it a fatal blow. The existence of such a tribulation was naturally to test the cultivators who had touched the rules, and to eliminate those who were not qualified. Therefore, such a tribulation naturally could not really throw Luo Fan into the chaotic state that only true saints and existences of the same level could exist. It was precisely because of this understanding that Luo Fan was so convinced in his heart that the grayish existence in front of him, which looked perfect and flawless in his eyes, could not really be perfect and flawless. There was only one reason why he felt that it was perfect and flawless. That was, his observation was not detailed enough, and his senses were not sharp enough, so he did not discover the existence of the flaws. With this mentality, he gradually calmed down. Even if his body and his concept of existence were constantly being eroded, assimilated, and worn down by the grayish state around him, he could no longer be moved. At this moment, he wholeheartedly sensed and experienced his surroundings, looking for the flaws that must exist around him. This grayish state was constructed by the fifth tribulation, and it was an unprecedented deep simulation of the chaotic state. There was only one way to find the flaws of such an existence, and that was to compare it with the true chaotic state. Fortunately, ever since he could sense the chaotic state, Luo Fan had never given up on the idea of absorbing nutrients from the chaotic state, and through the various evolutions and changes of the chaotic state, he could obtain nutrients for his own cultivation. Therefore, although he could not see through the chaotic state due to his realm and knowledge, his familiarity with the chaotic state was not inferior to any other cultivator. As he sensed and distinguished carefully all the mysteries of the chaotic state that he had seen, sensed, comprehended, and guessed for hundreds of millions of years continuously emerged from the depths of his memory. They constantly appeared, and gradually compared with what he saw and sensed at this moment, and the simulated chaotic state in front of him. It was self-evident how deep the simulation was to be able to make Luo Fan feel as if he was really in the chaotic state. It was needless to say how difficult it was to find out what existed, what was not simulated properly, and what was different from the true state of chaos. In this simulated chaotic state, the space-time characteristics of the chaotic state were clearly simulated. In other words, his perception of time and space had been distorted here, and it had become a state of absolute chaos. At this moment, Luo Fan had completely lost his sense of time. Even the perception of time in his will had disappeared due to the simulated chaotic state around him. Now, in order to measure time, the only thing he could do was to measure the degree to which his body was being eroded. It was only through this that he was able to sense the flow of time and roughly guess how much time had passed. He sensed that his body was disappearing bit by bit, being devoured by the murky chaos around him bit by bit, becoming a part of it. In turn, it began to corrode the parts of his body that were still intact, continuously corroding and assimilating more parts of his body, turning them into a part of him. This situation was simply like an ordinary person watching a blunt knife cutting his heart bit by bit, pushing him towards the abyss of death bit by bit. That kind of horror was self-evident. Of course, as mentioned before, this was not enough to make Luo Fan move at all, let alone make him feel fear. Then, after calculating the degree of his body being eroded and assimilated, Luo Fan waited for a few decades before finally grasping a subtle flaw. This subtle flaw was none other than the process of his body being eroded. He had once sent an incarnation into the chaotic state. Although there was a world of difference between his current strength and his strength back then, and they were not on the same level at all. However, the process of his incarnation being eroded and whittled away was also a revelation for him now. Back then, his incarnation did not even have time to feel any changes before it was completely erased by the chaotic state. Even the memories of the incarnation's existence were completely erased. Even now, he did not know how many times he had sent his incarnation into the chaotic state to be erased, but now, in the chaotic state simulated by the fifth Great Tribulation, he could clearly feel that the chaotic state was eroding, assimilating, and erasing his body and his concept of existence. He could even use this process to measure time. There was a huge difference between this and the true primal chaos state. This was obviously the difference between the simulated chaotic state and the true chaotic state, and it was also the flaw of the simulated chaotic state. After understanding this difference, for Luo Fan, it was equivalent to directly tearing open a door in a seamless sky and seeing a brand new world, a brand new heaven and earth. At this moment, he integrated all his senses into the process of this erosion and began to carefully experience the traces of the passage of time in this process. After speculating about the degree of erosion for decades, he finally barely grasped some subtle traces of space-time fluctuations. At this moment, his body had almost been completely obliterated, and the concept of his existence was only left with an extremely illusory silhouette. It seemed as if it would completely collapse in the next moment, completely obliterated. At this moment, an indescribable smile flashed in his heart. The fluctuations began to continuously magnify in his senses, and in the end, it filled his entire mind and occupied his entire world. Immediately after, he felt the erosion and assimilation effect of the simulated chaotic state stop instantly. It stopped outside of that fluctuation, outside of his body. With this change, his concept of existence began to rapidly recover. The concept of existence that was originally blurry, as if it would completely collapse in the next instant and disappear without a trace, had completely recovered to its peak state in just a short moment. In fact, because of some extremely strange spacetime fluctuations on the surface, this concept of existence seemed to have become a bit stronger than its peak state. Corresponding to this concept of existence, his body in the real world started to reappear. Not long after, his body was reconstructed, and his body looked no different from how it was in the beginning. When everything recovered, Luo Fan looked at the simulated chaotic state again, but he already saw a completely different world. Looking at the surroundings through the fluctuations, it was no longer a large expanse of gray, but had turned into an extremely mysterious and strange world. It seemed to be a world that was randomly glued together by countless lights and shadows, and contained endless profound and unfathomable principles. At this moment, the world was constantly turbulent and constantly changing. All kinds of indescribable power were continuously released in this process, releasing towards the entire world and constantly affecting all existences that stepped into this world. This included Luo Fan, who was now enveloped by the strange space-time fluctuations. This is the fifth great calamity. When Luo Fan saw this scene, such a thought flashed through his mind. With this thought, he raised his head to look at the sky. Above the sky was a boundless void. It was deep and unfathomable, as if it hid infinite danger and contained infinite mysteries, as if it contained something in the world and the universe within it. There seemed to be some kind of gaze coming from the deepest part, enveloping the world that seemed to be randomly glued together by countless lights and shadows, including Luo Fan. What a powerful existence! At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, cold sweat began to continuously seep out from the surface of his body, and it was gradually shredded by the surrounding fluctuations, turning into nothingness and disappearing without a trace. This gaze did not contain any power, nor did it have the powerful oppression that ordinary cultivators would have when they used their vision to oppress other living beings. It seemed to be a very calm and ordinary gaze that did not contain any emotions. However, it was this ordinary gaze that made Luo Fan feel an indescribable pressure from the depths of his heart. Moreover, this pressure became stronger and stronger as time passed, and as he was under that gaze for a longer period of time. Faintly, he could even hear cracking sounds from the depths of his heart. At this moment, a figure slowly walked toward him from the depths of the sky. This figure was extremely illusory, as if it was just an extremely ordinary shadow. As it walked out from the depths of the void, its figure seemed to have completely merged with the surrounding darkness, forming a completely inseparable relationship. It was even difficult to distinguish whether it existed or not. However, Luo Fan could tell at a glance that the gaze that made him feel incomparably terrified came from that figure. As the figure continued to approach, its outline also became more and more distinct. Not long after, in less than the blink of an eye, that figure had already become an extremely distinct shadow. A real, indescribable shadow. When this primer stepped into this world, its body gradually appeared in strange colors. These strange colors were a strange scene formed by the random combination of various gorgeous colors. It looked very strange and terrifying. However, its colors resonated with the surrounding world and the light and shadows that filled the world, completely merging into one. Under this change, the figure simply looked like it was born from the surrounding world. It was like this world, the shadow of this world. This shadow did not have any aura, or even a physical body. With Luo Fan's current perception of the strength of cultivators, there was no title that could be applied to this shadow at all. It was like a non-existent figure that walked out from the void, only occasionally revealing some of its claws in the real world. At this moment, the shadow seemed to be extremely slow as it walked toward Luo Fan. However, in the blink of an eye, it had already traversed a distance of trillions of light years, from the depths of the void to arrive in front of Luo Fan. The silhouette of this figure had the silhouette of a born Taoism aptitude, and its figure was even similar to Luo Fan's. After it appeared, it simply raised its hand and slapped at Luo Fan. This slap was slow, and there was almost no force behind it. As for the mysterious power or magic contained within it, there was not even the slightest hint of it. It looked like the most ordinary of palms, the most ordinary slap. However, this slap and the force behind it made Luo Fan feel an unimaginable sense of danger. The warning in his heart was constantly reminding him that he had to dodge this palm strike. Otherwise, he would lose his life here. He obviously did not doubt the warning in his heart at all. In fact, even if he did doubt the warning in his heart, he would not dare to take the risk and ignore everything at this moment. At this moment, he increased his heart power in a frenzy, and his power surged crazily. All his understanding and mastery of the nomological worldview began to erupt from the depths of his soul at this moment. As this eruption occurred, the fluctuations on his body began to distort, and a figure with a constantly changing face spread out from his body, covering his body like a suit of armor. Immediately after, an indescribable light was emitted from the armor-like figure, which was wrapped in the strange space-time fluctuations. It turned into a barrier that emitted an eternal and indestructible aura that pressed toward the illusory figure. This barrier was a type of defense. However, when it reached such a powerful level, its power was no longer limited to mere defense. Any existence that was hit by this barrier would definitely not be able to withstand its additional power as long as it could not withstand the eternal and indestructible aura of the barrier. In other words, under the impact of this barrier, it would definitely collapse and explode into pieces. This was also what Luo Fan was looking forward to now. He was looking forward to the figure suffering such a fate. Of course, this was just looking forward to. Luo Fan was actually quite clear that the possibility of such a method succeeding was basically negligible. Therefore, at this moment, the moment the barrier was pushed out, he made his move again. He suddenly raised his hand, and an extremely powerful light erupted from his hand. It began to stir the mottled and messy shadows around him, stirring them up and condensing them around the light, gradually forming a huge finger. After that, he pushed this finger without hesitation, followed the barrier, and blasted it toward the figure. All these actions sounded complicated, but the entire process actually did not take any time at all. With just a thought from Luo Fan, everything had already been completed, and he had directly sent it to the front of that figure. Facing the barrier, the figure's palm did not change at all. It was still neither fast nor slow, and it directly slapped the palm. Then, a change that even Luo Fan could not understand appeared on the palm. With the appearance of this inexplicable and indescribable change, the barrier that contained the charm of eternal indestructibility and indestructibility exploded with a loud bang, directly blasting the area formed by the overlapping light and shadows in the surroundings, turning it into an indescribable vacuum. After that, the palm did not change at all. It was still as ordinary as before, and even the many strange light and shadow blocks that were constantly swimming on it were still swimming at this moment. Be it the amplitude or the frequency, there was no change at all. It was as if the barrier that Luo Fan blasted out just now, which could overturn any perfect world and even directly change the world, did not exist at all. Faced with such a change, the warning signs in Luo Fan's heart rose to the peak. At this moment, a strange light and shadow that was covered by the surrounding fluctuations appeared around his body. This strange light and shadow formed a gray, absolute state of chaos. In this state, everything could be found and nothing could be determined. This was none other than the attack that Luo Fan had condensed with the help of the world view and formed with the combination of every concept ability. This kind of attack could be said to have reached the limit that he could reach. It contained almost all the mysteries of the worldview, and it also contained all his cultivation achievements from the beginning of his cultivation until now. It could be said that this was already the sublimation of Luo Fan's cultivation in his entire life. However, at this moment, facing that figure, Luo Fan still did not feel much sense of security. At this moment, he let out a soft cry in his heart, and the chaotic light and shadow that seemed to be in a state of chaos frantically poured into the armor that seemed to have an ever-changing face on the surface of his body at this moment. As the chaotic light and shadow poured in, the originally ever-changing figure suddenly exploded, instantly turning into a gray, chaotic space that wrapped around Luo Fan's body. It began to churn continuously, constantly releasing all kinds of terrifying auras that could terrify the rulers on the third level. Chapter 21-28. After the layer of chaotic light fused with the ripples, it became even more chaotic. Vaguely, an indescribable connection was formed between it and the endless light in the surroundings. A subtle resonance appeared between the two. Under this resonance, there seemed to be some kind of power constantly communicating between the two, causing the chaotic light and shadow around Luo Fan's body to seemingly obtain some kind of sublimation. At this moment, the figure's palm had completely crushed Luo Fan's attack and slapped the chaotic light and shadow. At this moment, Luo Fan sensed that the palm was not just a palm, but a supreme and mysterious thing that he could not understand. When this object slapped onto the chaotic light silhouette, it instantly added an incomprehensible mystery to the light silhouette. Subsequently, the chaotic light silhouette gradually broke away from his control. Not only did it no longer have any effect on the shadow's palm, it even welcomed the palm and continued to approach Luo Fan's location. It turned out that all of Luo Fan's defenses and methods were completely useless in front of that shadow's palm strike. At this moment, no matter what ideas or methods Luo Fan had, it was already too late to use them. This was because the palm had already broken through the layers of defenses and was directly imprinted on his chest. As the palm entered, the armor-like artifact that was constantly changing between a spell and a magic treasure that covered his body like armor was completely useless. It was like a real shadow and was directly passed through by the shadow's palm. Crack! At this moment, Luo Fan felt that his body was collapsing, and his concept of existence was also collapsing. The collapsing body and the concept of existence were added with some kind of indescribable mystery. Under the effect of this mystery, all of his collapsed fragments did not disappear. Instead, they accompanied the mystery and shot in all directions, directly into the endless chaotic light and shadow, and completely integrated into it. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared without a trace. At this stage, only the colorful shadow was left in this area, quietly suspended in the midst of the chaotic light and shadow. Apart from this, all traces of Luo Fan's existence had disappeared without a trace. It was as if Luo Fan had never existed in this world. At this moment, the shadow seemed to have turned into a statue and was quietly suspended in the air. The various colored blocks on it squirmed and shifted slightly. This squirming and shifting didn't seem to have any pattern, as if it was just a random movement of absolute chaos. However, in fact, it seemed to contain the most profound and mysterious truth in the universe. This truth seemed to even surpass the true sage level. At this moment, the shadow suddenly trembled. During this tremble, its face began to gradually change. From the originally blurry outline that could not be seen, it gradually turned into a specific face. However, this face still could not be seen clearly and could not be described. Anyone who saw this face would know what it looked like, but as long as they looked carefully, they would find that their previous impression was completely wrong. The specific face was not like what they had seen before. If they looked away, they would instantly find that they had completely forgotten everything they had seen and remembered when they had seen this face. "This is someone's sage tribulation?" the shadow murmured. Its voice was very mysterious. Every tone, every syllable, and every tone was like a chaotic divine thunder that could split the heavens and earth. It shook the simulated chaotic state and stirred it continuously, and an unknown number of spacetimes were born and destroyed in its voice. No, compared to the power of the sage tribulation, it is much weaker. That's right, it's a tribulation triggered by going against the flow of time. Immediately after, he denied his previous guess, and a look of understanding appeared on his face. Evidently, he had seen through the foundation of the fifth great tribulation in an instant. At this moment, countless light and shadows flashed in his eyes. There were countless worlds within them, and in each of those worlds, there was the image of a living being that was brighter than the other living beings' images. This person does indeed have the foundation to achieve Tao. I hope that you can become my friend in the future. The figure suddenly smiled. Immediately after, he blew lightly. In an instant, the completely chaotic simulated chaotic state began to undergo some extremely subtle changes. Within these subtle changes, there was some sort of mystery that was added to the simulated chaotic state. This mystery had unbelievable power, enough to increase the power of the simulated chaotic state by several times. But at the same time, because of this mysterious existence, the flaw of the simulated chaos state had become even larger. It was much easier to grasp the flaw of the simulated chaos state than before. At this moment, an inexplicable sense of doubt appeared out of nowhere. I didn't break the rules. You used my shadow to impose the tribulation, and I took the initiative to help you now. Of course, this small matter of increasing the flaws is unavoidable. I'm not chaos after all, so it's understandable that my methods are weaker. The figure chuckled and said. As he said that, the doubt gradually disappeared. Immediately after, the surroundings returned to normal, and there was no difference from before. At this moment, the figure's eyes once again reflected the figures in the endless world, and a faint smile appeared on his face. Immediately after, the figure suddenly trembled and collapsed, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. This simulated chaotic state returned to the state that Luo Fan saw at the beginning. It was exactly the same as the chaotic state. However, compared to before, there seemed to be an additional mystery above this chaotic state. It was as mysterious as the supreme Tao in this simulated chaotic state. Under this mystery, the simulated chaotic state was indeed powerful, but there were already some traces that could be found as it operated. These traces that could be found were crucial clues for any living beings who wanted to understand the reality of this simulated chaotic state. If Luo Fan could see these traces, he would definitely be able to see through the reality of this simulated chaotic state at a speed that was reduced by 100 times compared to before. He might even have a chance to control this reality. Of course, on the other hand, due to the mysterious existence inside, if he was in this simulated chaotic state, the speed at which he was eroded and assimilated would definitely be many times faster than before. The damage he would suffer would also be many times more severe than before. After all, the power had increased, however. This drawback seemed so insignificant compared to the benefit. After all, whether it was the original power or the current power, for Luo Fan it was a kind of power that was difficult to resist. Which of the two irresistible powers was stronger? The only difference between him being crushed into a few thousand pieces and being crushed into tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of pieces was clearly the difference between them. Obviously, regardless of whether it was thousands of pieces or tens of thousands of pieces, they were all pieces. To him, it was just death. What was the difference in essence? Using this kind of drawback, that had no difference in essence to obtain benefits that were more obvious was obviously a huge gain for Luo Fan. In other words, it was obvious that the existence of the true divine shadow was helping him from the side of course. The current Luo Fan obviously had no concept of all this. At this moment, he had completely lost all his senses. Even his concept of existence had been turned into billions of pieces that were scattered to various parts of the boundless simulated chaotic state. At this moment, his mind, his will, and his senses were divided into billions and trillions of parts, sinking into the mysterious place that simulated the state of chaos. It was as if he had stepped into billions and trillions of worlds to reincarnate and become a living being in that world. Among the countless living beings, almost all of them were left with their instincts. They did not have any memories of their original bodies, and they did not know who they were, what they wanted to pursue, or what their situation was like. They could only reincarnate in the world according to the rules of the world they were in. Only some of the insignificant parts could vaguely feel these things, and they vaguely knew that what they wanted to pursue was supreme transcendence. They knew that they were missing a huge part, among them, in a certain world. The living being that Luo Fan reincarnated into suddenly had a flash of inspiration before he died, and he suddenly recalled a trace of complete memories. At Luo Fan's level, memories also had endless power. Just this trace of memory had already brazenly dispelled all the shackles and power that this world had attached to his body. All that was left was a trace of pure spiritual light that floated in the void. The heavenly disaster where he was originally standing was instantly frozen by the power of this wisp of memory. It was as if the entire world had been completely stopped at this moment. "I'm Luo Fan. I'm going through the tribulation." An extremely weak and lost voice came from the spiritual light. Ever since Luo Fan had stepped foot into cultivation, the amount of time that he had experienced, and the things that he had experienced had reached a level that any living being could not believe. This trace of memory naturally could not contain everything that he had experienced. At this moment, this memory only allowed him to understand his identity and what he was doing. As for everything else, his cultivation, his attainments in the Tao, his strength, and even the various divine abilities and profound techniques he'd comprehended in the past, and even his view of the world, they didn't exist at all. At this moment, a broken and strange shadow gradually appeared in the depths of the spiritual light. Like a stream of light, it started to wrap around the spiritual light. Under the cover of this shadow, the spiritual light was gradually nourished, and its originally pure state became even more profound. There were also traces of indestructible and inextinguishable auras being released from its body. The spiritual light that did not have a cultivation realm was at a loss at this moment. It did not know how it should deal with this world, nor did it know why it had become like this. To break this world. Although it was only a very, very small part of Luo Fan, it was still Luo Fan, after all. Its intelligence was not lacking, and it also had complete logical thinking. Therefore, this wisp of light quickly figured out what his ultimate goal was. After understanding this, it naturally knew what direction it should work towards. When one's cultivation reached a certain level, Luo Fan's every action, every thought, every breath, and every thought contained all sorts of inconceivable principles, and contained endless unimaginable mysteries. At this moment, the memories that Luo Fan had obtained were only strands, and there were no memories related to cultivation or cultivation realms. However, just the indescribable charm from those strands of memories was enough to guide this small portion of Luo Fan to step onto the path of cultivation. At this moment, the spiritual light trembled slightly and strands of light were constantly separated, gradually weaving inside and outside of it. Looking at the way it was woven, although it was broken, it indeed contained some mysteries of the world of laws. At this moment, all sorts of indescribable truths appeared in the spiritual light's heart. These truths were mysterious and wonderful. Although it was only the first time he had comprehended them, it was as if he had comprehended them for millions of years. All sorts of wondrous uses of these truths and the various powers that they could unleash already existed in his heart. Under such circumstances, Ling Guang's strength was increasing with every breath. His cultivation was also increasing. In just a few short breaths, the spiritual light had completely changed. It looked like it was woven from countless rays of light to form a Luo Fan, quietly floating under the shadow. Suddenly, a light flashed in Luo Fan's mind, and he suddenly comprehended some kind of key point. Under this key point, his body that was originally woven from light began to grow flesh and blood. Not long after, it had already turned into a real Luo Fan, a Luo Fan with a body of flesh and blood. So, this is who I am. When the body was formed, the body slowly opened its mouth. There was an indescribable emotion in its eyes, as well as a subtle sense of realization. It was as if it had finally recognized itself at this moment. Only now did it know who it was. At this moment, the way it looked at the world before it had undergone an earth-shattering change. Although it was only through the subtle charm from the memories that he had stepped onto the path of cultivation, the current Luo Fan had already reached the connate grand Luo realm in terms of cultivation realm alone. To ordinary living beings, this level was practically the highest goal that they pursued in their entire lives, and it was a supreme achievement that could only be achieved after spending countless years. However, to Luo Fan, this achievement was only the foundation of the foundation, the crudeness of the crudeness, so it was naturally extremely easy for him to step onto it. With the connate grand Luo realm, Luo Fan could already split the world apart and be self-sufficient. On the other hand, the calamity that the world that he was originally in had only caused the entire world's laws to be overturned, causing the world to collapse. Such a calamity was clearly not difficult to deal with for a connate grand Luo realm cultivator. Especially under the circumstances that this world was only at the level of the Great Thousand World, it was even more so. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart jolted slightly. The shadow that enveloped his body shook slightly, and it had already split apart. It transformed into countless rays of light that pierced into the surrounding space and fused into the depths of the laws of this world. It started to connect with the numerous laws of the world and gradually gained control over them. After all, he was only a connate golden immortal. Even though he'd relied on his own comprehension and the might of an object that possessed the property of being indestructible and indestructible, Luo Fan had practically exhausted all of his energy to accomplish this. At this moment, his body was trembling slightly. As the power within his body surged, there was even an indescribable pain that surged incessantly throughout his body. It surged towards him ceaselessly and wanted to drown his mind. However, he was still Luo Fan after all. Even if it was so painful and uncomfortable, he did not have any thoughts of giving up because of it. At this moment, under his mental command, the countless lines formed by the illusory figure trembled slightly, and they completely overturned all the laws in this entire world. At this moment, a powerful potential was transmitted to him through the lines of the shadow, and it instantly caused the shadow that enveloped his body to explode, causing the shadow to turn into smoke in the blink of an eye, and it kept rolling around his body. However, it was fortunate that the illusory figure had already exploded, and the energy from the explosion had spread out. By the time it reached his body, there was not even the slightest bit of it remaining. That was why his face was only slightly pale, and he did not completely collapse and die. At this moment, the entire world trembled slightly, and an extremely beautiful voice resounded throughout the world. This voice contained boundless joy, an indescribable joy. It was like a person who had come back from the dead and was expressing his joy to the entire world. Chapter 21-29. In a trance, he sensed that he seemed to have fused with the world. Various mysterious existences continuously surged towards him from the world, fusing into his body and mind, making him feel like he was gradually being filled up. Following this change, he felt that his eyes seemed to be able to vaguely see some blurry images outside this world. Outside this world, there was neither chaos nor void. Instead, there were endless worlds that seemed to be glued together like biological cells. Among these endless worlds, every single one of them was essentially the same as the one he was currently in. They were equally complete, equally profound, and equally filled with inconceivable mysteries. And from these many worlds, he could vaguely sense that there was a part of him in almost all of them. Transcend this world and gather all the parts that belong to me in all the worlds. At this moment, he had a clearer understanding of what he should do. It was no longer the kind of understanding that he could only think of based on his instincts and breaking through this world. This world was also extremely complete, but its structure and form were completely different from all the worlds that Luo Fan knew in his memories. The entire world seemed to be in a strange balance of movement and stillness. Whether it was originally moving or still, everything in this world had both characteristics of movement and stillness. Moreover, these two qualities were combined in an extremely mysterious way, forming an extremely mysterious and mystical whole. It was arranged in the world, filling the entire world, making the world incomparably lively. Even though this world had just turned around from the apocalypse, it was still extremely desolate. All the living beings in it had already disappeared, and there was no time for them to be reborn, so this vividness could not be changed. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly. His body shook, and the endless lines that had fused with the endless laws in this world rapidly shrank. In the blink of an eye, they had already condensed into a robe on the surface of his body, covering him. It looked like an extremely ordinary robe. After doing this, his heart moved slightly. He lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure broke through space and time, broke through the layers of laws, and directly stepped into the world. In reality, there was an extremely close connection between the world and the cognition of living beings. In other words, the existence of the world was closely related to the cognition of living beings. For example, in the unseen world, it didn't exist in the eyes of other cultivators. In that case, the other world in their cognition didn't exist. In the unseen world, although the great Tao still existed in their senses, it existed in a completely different state from what Luo Fan knew. In other words, to Luo Fan, the existence of the world was not actually limited by any situation in the world, but by Luo Fan's own cognition. Luo Fan believed that the world had an existence in the world, so the world would naturally have the ability to accept him. The great Tao would also directly appear in the world. The world was so mysterious. Just like at this moment, although the world where Luo Fan was in was unprecedentedly mysterious and strange, in his cognition, such a world could still exist in the world. Then, he could naturally come to the world of the world and directly see the source of all the laws of this world, the origin of all spacetime, the source of all power, the source of everything, the source of everything, the source of everything, the great Tao. As for this essence, Luo Fan did not understand it until he stepped onto the road of Tao Master. His cultivation realm continued to improve, and his knowledge continued to grow. His current body only had a little insignificant memory of his original body, so he naturally did not know these various essences. However, although he did not know, the fundamental concept that had been deeply engraved in the origin of life would not disappear. Therefore, at this time, he would not be unable to enter the world of the world because he had completely lost those memories. Looking at the endless and all-encompassing great Tao in front of him, which seemed to contain all the principles of the universe, Luo Fan was slightly at a loss. This great Tao was incomparably mysterious, and the principles contained in it were so profound that even he yearned for it at first glance. However, it was a pity that there was an extremely stubborn and resolute will at the bottom of his heart that prevented him from fusing with it. It prevented him from directly receiving the principles and mysteries within it and fusing them into his body to strengthen his own cultivation. The attitude of that will towards the incomparably mysterious great Tao in front of him was faintly disdainful, as if some of the principles contained in this great Tao were so insignificant, at least to him, absolutely insignificant. Why is it like this? At this time, Luo Fan was a little at a loss. Fortunately, although he was only a part of Luo Fan, he was still Luo Fan after all. Although his past cultivation memories had all disappeared, the fundamental true meaning of cultivation had not disappeared. At this moment, he looked into his body and began to inspect his entire body, his soul, and his life source. Through this inspection, he discovered a secret that he had not discovered when he had constructed his body. Although his body was slightly inferior to the great Tao before him as a whole, in a certain aspect, it seemed to be countless times more profound than the great Tao before him. Moreover, the existence that was more profound than the great Tao was extremely suitable for him. As soon as he sensed it, he felt indescribably comfortable and joyful. He could not help but want to pour his entire body and mind into it. So, it's the law. At this moment, a thought flashed through his mind. With this thought, he looked at the great path in front of him again and discovered that the appearance of the great path in his eyes had completely changed. The various expressions that were originally extremely mysterious and contained a lot of information began to transform into a unique existence. Laws. To Luo Fan, this was extremely familiar. He even felt that it was like his most fundamental and mysterious existence. It was like the most basic unit that constructed all the information, all the principles, and all the power in the great Tao. Everything, even everything else. With this change, he felt that his body seemed to have turned into a black hole that began to frantically absorb the structure of the law that was revealed in the great Tao. He even faintly constructed a unique outline in his heart. During this process, time gradually passed. After an unknown period of time, when a powerful repulsive force acted on Luo Fan's body, he realized that a humanoid outline had appeared in his heart. The human silhouette seemed to be formed by the accumulation of countless specks of light. It sat cross-legged in his heart, and as the specks of light moved about, it was as if the silhouette was constantly wriggling and changing its shape. Every inch of its muscles and skin seemed to be wriggling and moving about. It looked incredibly strange and mystical. So this is a false saint. Sensing the changes in his body, Luo Fan felt an indescribable sense of loss, but also an inexplicable sense of joy. Currently, his cultivation realm was already hundreds of millions of times stronger than when he had just taken form when he was a connate zenith heaven. At this moment, he had even formed a powerful pressure on the great Tao, causing the operation of the great Tao to faintly become chaotic. This chaos flowed out of the great Tao and poured into the surface spacetime, causing it to undergo a shocking change. The entire spacetime began to fluctuate violently. Under the intense tremors, the shape of the entire spacetime began to change. There was chaos everywhere, and there were changes everywhere. The changes were not much different from the doomsday that this world had encountered back then. With this change, it was no wonder that this world would reject Luo Fan's existence. It's a pity that I'm not the false saint of this world, but my own false saint. Otherwise, I would be able to dominate this world. Luo Fan sighed, and an inexplicable sense of helplessness appeared on his face. He felt that the great Tao in front of him still had a great significance to him. He could still absorb a large amount of nourishment from the great Tao, allowing him to continue growing. It was precisely because of this that he was unwilling to leave this world at this moment. It was a pity that although he had already become a false saint, what he had achieved was not the false saint of this world. In other words, he did not fuse with this world, and he did not rely on the power of this world to cross the layers of realms and step into the false saint realm. Instead, he relied on his own strength, his own comprehension, and his own body as the foundation to step into the false saint realm. If there was a way to become a false saint in the past, then he would be the strongest ruler of this world. In this world, he would be the supreme saint, and he would almost have all the power of a true saint. As long as the world was not destroyed, he would be indestructible. However, it was obvious that with Luo Fan's method of becoming a false saint, it was impossible for him to have such convenience. In this way, his presence in this world had already started to impact the world itself, causing the existence of this world to be affected. In other words, just his existence alone had caused the world to tremble, vaguely causing the world to be in danger of collapsing. In this way, it would be strange if the world did not reject him, although he knew that this world was only a world born from the fifth calamity. It was still a world that he was born in after all. After all, it was a world that had given him so many benefits. In the end, Luo Fan was not heartless enough to destroy this world easily. Thus, at this moment, he sighed and stopped comprehending the Grand Tao. With a thought in his heart, he went along with the world's repulsive force towards him, and his body shook before he was sent out of this world and appeared in between the barriers of that world. The barrier of this world was none other than the layer of invisible existence between the countless worlds that were glued together like cells. This layer of invisible existence separated the many worlds, preventing them from merging into one. This barrier had no direction, no size, and even no time. In it, it was like a mosquito that had fallen into amber. Even his body, mind, and will were about to be completely frozen, and he could not control himself. Fortunately, Luo Fan was already a false saint, but he was no longer an ordinary cultivator. Even when he entered this barrier, various spacetimes naturally appeared around him and naturally accommodated his existence. This method sounded amazing, but it wasn't even worth mentioning when it was explained. After all, this barrier itself was a barrier that isolated the many worlds. In other words, it was impossible for the worlds to fuse with the barrier. In this way, rushing into the worlds through the barrier was equivalent to adding bricks and tiles to the entire barrier world system, adding some worlds to the barrier world system. In other words, the spacetimes that Luo Fan had created were essentially no different from the world he had been in before in the entire barrier world system. After creating these spacetimes, Luo Fan directly sat between those worlds and began to close his eyes. He spread his senses out and followed the senses between the worlds to spread to the many world. The world he had been in previously could not accommodate his existence and directly expelled him. The many worlds that were connected to that world were similar in nature and level to that world, so their tolerance for him was obviously not much stronger. Under such circumstances, if he entered them, the greatest possibility was that he would definitely be rejected by those worlds. He naturally had a way to deal with the rejection. However, that was equivalent to going against the world. If it was one or two worlds, he could naturally accept it. However, at this moment, he looked over and saw that the number of worlds around him was calculated in the billions. Resisting the rejection of so many worlds again and again, and entering them to fuse with a part of himself was definitely not a pleasant thing. Therefore, at this moment, when he realized that the spacetime he had opened could also fuse with the barrier world system, he instantly made a decision to directly use the connection between these newly created worlds and the many barrier worlds to achieve his goal. After integrating his senses into the worlds, Luo Fan instantly sensed the experiences of countless parts of himself in the many world. Compared to him being able to awaken, the experiences of the other parts of his body were not so lucky. Even the luckiest of those body parts had reincarnated dozens of times in the many world. The unluckier ones had even reincarnated tens of thousands of times. Even now, who knew how many body parts of himself were dying time and time again, how pitiful! Luo Fan sighed. His senses surged, and his power was stimulated. Like fishing, he fished out his body parts from the many world. Of course, what he was targeting now was naturally those body parts that were dying, where everything they had in that world was disappearing, and where a bit of their spirit light was leaving their body. After all, such existences had already lost their body structure, and the restraining force of that world had reached the lowest level. Compared to body parts from other worlds, the difficulty of fishing them out was much easier. During this process, bits of spirit light constantly flickered from the many worlds and quickly entered the spacetime that Luo Fan had opened at this moment through the connection between the worlds, continuously fusing with his body. With every bit of spirit light fusing with him, Luo Fan felt strands of memories continuously appear in his heart. In a trance, he felt that he had regained many of the insights that he had lost. As these bits of memories enriched him, his cultivation realm also involuntarily increased. In just a few short years, he had already stepped from the false saint realm to the despair realm. As his cultivation realm increased, his sense of existence became even greater, and the pressure on the surrounding spacetime also became much stronger than before. Unknowingly, the membrane that he was in had already expanded to more than thousands of times its original size. Under this change, the surrounding worlds were constantly pushed away, making this place seem like a bright moon in a sky full of stars. The entire membrane world was not unchanging. In fact, the entire membrane world could be said to be undergoing some kind of subtle movement at all times. It was difficult to determine the pattern of this subtle movement. There seemed to be no pattern at all, but there seemed to be an incomparably mysterious pattern in it. As Luo Fan grew, his weight gradually suppressed more and more world. Gradually, it affected the operation of the membrane world system, gradually changing the movement trajectory of the surrounding worlds. Vaguely, he became the rotation axis of more and more worlds, making more and more worlds begin to circulate around him. Although he had already pushed his cultivation to the level of the Desperator and was many times stronger than before, it was still not enough to stop him. However, the body parts that Luo Fan found now were only a small part that was not worth mentioning. To say that it was a drop in the ocean would be an exaggeration of the weight of the body parts that he found. Under such circumstances, it could be imagined that the process of Luo Fan's weight continuously increasing would definitely last for a very long time. Chapter 2130. Time continued to pass in Luo Fan's senses. At every moment, endless memories seeped into his heart and fused with him, allowing him to comprehend who knew how much he had cultivated and the various cultivation principles he knew. Originally, he only had an outline in his heart, and most of it was empty, but now it was gradually being filled up and made up for. With this change, Luo Fan gradually understood. So this was his view of the world. This was his view of the world. After understanding this, his cultivation speed became faster and faster, and the extent of his improvement also became greater and greater. In a trance, the speed at which he pulled his body parts from the many worlds around him became even faster. He did not know how much time passed like this. It seemed like millions of years, but it also seemed like just a few short years. At a certain moment, Luo Fan suddenly found that he no longer had any body parts to collect, and no memories to awaken. This situation suddenly brought him back from the absolute enjoyment. He opened his eyes and looked around, and there was an inexplicable sense of loss. He clearly felt that there were still many gaps in his memory, there were still patches of blankness, and his cultivation realm had only increased to the level of a calamity expert. This clearly meant that he was not complete. It meant that a large portion of his body parts and a large portion of his memories had not returned, but now, he felt that there were no longer any body parts that belonged to him in the endless worlds around him. All the worlds were clean, and all the body parts that belonged to him had been collected by him. This kind of contradiction made him feel inexplicably surprised at this moment, and a look of bewilderment appeared on his face. Why is it like this? Where are the other parts? He muttered as his senses swept out in all directions, searching for the other parts of his body that might still exist. After searching for who knew how long, at a certain moment, he suddenly encountered an incomparably familiar sense. This sense was boundless and extremely profound, and in terms of realm, it felt like it complemented his. So that's how it is. In an instant, Luo Fan understood what was going on. The perception he came into contact with was none other than the individual perception condensed from other parts of his body. In other words, in addition to him constantly gathering body parts and condensing them into a whole, there was another body part that was gathering body parts in another place that was outside of his range of perception. It was even outside of his range of knowledge. It was also gathering body parts in order to condense a complete Luo Fan. The reason why he didn't sense or discover their existence was very simple. That was because those areas were beyond his knowledge. They were in areas that he didn't think existed at all. Do you want me to fight with every part of my body? At this time, Luo Fan smiled bitterly. After the many body parts were separated and reunited, they had already become different individuals. Once these different individuals fused, they would naturally become the real Luo Fan. However, before they truly fused, they were just parts that belonged to Luo Fan. It was like all the cells in a person's body. In fact, all the cells were actually tiny creatures. If they were separated, they could actually be regarded as independent creatures. However, the cells of ordinary creatures were too weak and couldn't be self-sufficient. Once they were separated, they would only die. Therefore, there wasn't anything special about it just now. However, for an existence at Luo Fan's level, his power had already connected every detail of his body and completed every smallest area of his body in this way, even the smallest detail of his body, even if it was originally impossible for other creatures to separate, be independent, or even exist completely, had obtained the ability to be self-sufficient. Therefore, they could become independent on their own in this way. The current Luo Fan could be said to be Luo Fan, but more accurately, it should be the condensed will of a part of Luo Fan. This is fate. At this moment, an indescribable sigh appeared on Luo Fan's face. Originally, it was not difficult for Luo Fan to completely condense his body parts, but for him, it was not difficult at all. After all, no matter how many worlds and spacetimes there were, as long as one could be condensed, with enough time, one would naturally be able to condense all the body parts into one. In the end, all the body parts would be condensed into one, and the complete Luo Fan would be condensed. However, if different body parts were condensing Luo Fan, the situation would become billions of times more complicated. This was because each of them was Luo Fan, and each of them could be said to not be Luo Fan. If only one body part had a clear memory, he would naturally be the absolute main body. In the end, all the bodies and all the body parts would naturally be him. And he was willing to condense bit by bit like this. However, once different body parts were condensing, it would be different. This was because different body parts would condense different wills. They all belonged to Luo Fan, but they each had their own independent wills. These wills were willing to develop themselves into the real Luo Fan and condense all the body parts, but they were not willing to become a part of other wills, or become resources for other wills to form a complete Luo Fan. In other words, for them to condense themselves into Luo Fan, it was just their own growth. Although the final Luo Fan would be different from them now, it would only be similar to the will of an adult and the will of an infant. On the other hand, becoming a part of another's will and merging with another's will was equivalent to giving up on oneself and becoming a part of one's brother, allowing one's brother to grow to a higher level. That feeling was obviously completely different. In this way, it could be expected that the battle between the many body parts would definitely occur. Moreover, this battle would be incomparably tragic, so much so that even the existence of billions of worlds would not be able to contain it. It would result in an incomparably terrifying result, and even completely destroy everything created by the fifth great calamity. In the end, everything about him would be completely destroyed. All of these people were a part of Luo Fan. Their mentality and wills were actually similar to Luo Fan's. And Luo Fan was obviously not the kind of existence that was willing to completely abandon himself and sacrifice himself for others, even if those others were originally one with him. In this way, the outcome of their battle could almost be predicted. It was impossible for any part of his body to give up on itself. This kind of fusion would naturally take forever. In the end, it was even possible that they would all perish together. All parts of his body would perish in battle, causing Luo Fan's own fundamental existence to perish in this process. It was as if Luo Fan had never existed in the first place. This, perhaps, was the true difficulty of the fifth great calamity, compared to constructing a similar Luo Fan to fight against him in the past. This situation seemed even simpler, but in reality, it was many times more difficult than before. In the past, it could be considered a battle between Luo Fan and himself, but in the end, it was still a battle against another existence that was similar to himself. It was equivalent to a battle against his own shadow. But now it was a true battle between himself and himself. At this moment, the perception on the other side trembled violently. For a while, an indescribable sense of hostility spread out from that perception. Since he sensed the existence of the same body parts on the other side, Luo Fan naturally recognized the existence on the other side that was beyond his understanding. Naturally, that situation became part of his own understanding. In the blink of an eye, he felt his senses suddenly expand and a boundless void appeared before his eyes. In that boundless void there were countless worlds. These worlds existed in the form of the void, and they were like dark spots in the void that covered the void. And in the center of the void, there was a figure sitting cross-legged. The countless dark spots in the void were like the airflow around this figure, constantly revolving around this figure in a cycle. This figure's appearance was none other than Luo Fan's appearance. Looking at this figure, Luo Fan felt like he was looking at a mirror. That figure was extremely similar to him, and the space-time structure in that void was also extremely similar to the space-time structure where he was now. At this moment, the space-time membrane was also being pulled and revolved around him, moving in a circle. At this moment, there was only an indescribable expression on Luo Fan's face, and there was an indescribable helplessness on his face. I didn't expect it to be this kind of calamity. He sighed. With this sigh, his perception spread out, and he started to continuously adjust his perception. This ability to adjust one's perception was something that only an existence like him, who had condensed the embryonic form of a worldview, could do. After all, this method of adjusting one's perception out of thin air was simply subverting one's own power time and time again, subverting one's perception of the world. If it was an ordinary person, they would need to exhaust all of their mental energy every time they made an adjustment, and they would need to struggle in their heart countless times before they could finally complete the adjustment. In the process, they would even have to risk their perception collapsing and turning into a lunatic. Only an existence like Luo Fan, who had already condensed the worldview and could even condense his perception into something substantial, could easily change his perception and perception. He could quickly establish something that he originally thought could not exist in his heart. As he adjusted his perception, the world in front of him started to expand. One after another, different clusters of worlds entered his perception. In a trance, he felt that the membrane world system that he originally thought was everything was just an extremely ordinary one among the many worlds. Compared to the infinite worlds, the proportion it occupied was extremely insignificant. Among the many worlds there were all kinds of worlds. There were worlds that were like voids, worlds that were like membranes, worlds that were condensed from extremely dense solid matter, worlds that were like liquid that flowed endlessly and even constantly changed forms. There were worlds that were sometimes solid, sometimes liquid, and sometimes gas. There were all kinds of them, and there were all kinds of them. The number was many times more than what he had imagined. Moreover, this was only what he discovered after he changed his perception. If his perception did not even change, there was no need to mention how many worlds there were. Faced with such changes, Luo Fan sighed inwardly. As his perception swept across the many worlds, there were senses that came into contact with almost all of them. Naturally, a strange hostility was emitted from those worlds. These were the worlds where Luo Fan's body parts had stood out and gathered enough body parts to obtain independent, complete wills. As for the others, there was still no reaction. Either none of the body parts in those worlds had awakened, or the Luo Fan in those worlds did not have enough power to gather all of his body parts. Because everyone here could be said to be Luo Fan, their way of thinking and strength were extremely similar. Therefore, the speed at which they discovered each other was not much different, and the thoughts they had after discovering each other were not much different. Therefore, at this moment, the knowledge of all Luo Fans was like a big explosion, growing at a crazy rate. And as their senses came into contact and influenced each other, it in turn promoted each other's knowledge. In the end, they saw more and more worlds and heaven and earth groups. Just like that, in just a few years, the final number of worlds had increased to an unimaginable level. Devouring was naturally born in this process. Of course, the target of any Luo Fan to devour would naturally not be the Luo Fan that also had independent wills. Their targets of devouring were worlds that did not have any independent will. As for the distance between the worlds, it went without saying. As long as they changed their perception, those worlds would naturally be adjacent to the many worlds. Therefore, this distance was meaningless to Luo Fans. Many wills were competing among the worlds, constantly absorbing, fusing, and strengthening themselves. Under such circumstances, in just a few years, the worlds that did not have independent wills had completely disappeared, leaving only the worlds that had independent wills that still had Luo Fans. At this point, the many Luo Fans began to confront each other. They were all split from the same individual, their views and way of thinking were very similar, and they all knew this. Under such circumstances, they naturally understood what they had to do to benefit the whole and themselves. This confrontation was obviously going to continue for a long time. At least, it would be like this until they sensed that the fifth great calamity could not be withstood. Unless something unexpected happened. The Luo Fan in the membrane world system had also devoured many of the body parts of Luo Fan's blank worlds over the years. Moreover, compared to the majority of Luo Fans, the number he had devoured was not small. After all, no matter what, he was the first Luo Fan to discover the existence of other worlds. The number of world clusters that he knew was definitely the longest among all of them. Under such circumstances, it was natural for him to change his perception, bring his world closer to another world, and finally devour the body parts of Luo Fan's body in those worlds, or rather, fuse with the body parts. Of course, this kind of devouring or fusion wasn't always smooth sailing. In fact, along the way, he had competed with quite a number of Luo Fans. In this competition, He won and lost. Some directly took most of the body parts, while others only took a little bit. Giving up on myself for the sake of the whole, I still can't do such a thing. On this day, Luo Fan let out a long sigh, and there was some inexplicable regret on his face. What he could not do, the other Luo Fans could not do either. This also made him see the almost inevitable tragic outcome of the fifth great calamity. After thinking for a long time and feeling regretful for a long time, he finally suppressed his emotions and pushed all kinds of distracting thoughts to the back of his mind. If the outcome could not be changed, so what if he considered more? If he continued to think about it now, he would only be looking for trouble. In any case, even if he could not survive the fifth great calamity in the end, to him, as long as his life before that was exciting enough, it would not be considered a total loss. But why does the structure of these worlds feel a little familiar? After suppressing all the distracting thoughts, he suddenly had this doubt in his mind. Chapter 21:31. The existence that was extremely similar to the structure of the many worlds was none other than the third level of the Tao Master's path. In the third level of the Tao Master's path, every substance contained an extremely large number of almost perfect worlds. Obviously, there was a group of worlds in every substance. A group of worlds, due to the difference in the substance, the structure and the way of existence of the world group, would also change accordingly. The groups of worlds in the water, the groups of worlds in the air, the groups of worlds in the pneuma, the groups of worlds in the stone, and the groups of worlds in the living things all had their own characteristics and mysteries. Moreover, it seemed that the structure of the groups of worlds in Luo Fan's eyes was very similar. However, he was now inside the groups of worlds in the substance, while he was outside the numerous substances in the past, looking down at the countless groups of worlds. It was precisely because of the different perspectives that it took him so long to realize the similarities between the two, and to think of the connection between the two. So it's like this. Could it be that this tribulation is simulating the third level of the Tao Master's path? At this time, such a shocking thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, countless lights flashed in his mind, and the sparks of his thoughts almost connected to form a sea of fire. All kinds of possibilities and doubts constantly appeared in his mind. In the end, the scene that he had seen when he had just stepped into the fifth tribulation appeared in his eyes. That boundless, hazy, simulated state of chaos occupied his mind. His eyes, ears, and senses were all left with that simulated state of chaos from back then. That is not a simulation of the third level of the Tao Master's path, but a simulation of the state of chaos. In other words, not only is this place simulating the state of chaos, but even the third level of the Tao Master's path is actually simulating the state of chaos. Such a thought made Luo Fan's body tremble uncontrollably. A joy of grasping the only bit of truth in the boundless fog emerged from the bottom of his heart, and his mood suddenly became inexplicably excited. The state of chaos was a kind of existence that he could not completely understand. This kind of existence was all-encompassing. How many faces and how many levels did it have? Even the current him had no idea. In fact, he might never be able to figure it out. For the current him, the level of existence in the state of chaos was the vast transportation network built by many true sages, or even beings above true sages that could communicate with many great worlds and perfect world. Apart from that, there was a universe of negative emotions that permeated the entire state of chaos, or at least within the scope of his understanding. This existence formed an extremely miraculous connection with the transportation network, as if it was beneath the transportation network. Apart from that, there seemed to be a universe of positive emotions superimposed on it. There was also the wonderful world that he had seen in the memories of that chaos creature, just like that, level by level, no matter what level he reached, no matter how deep his understanding of the chaos was, he would always find that the chaos that he knew was still vaster and more real. His understanding was still just a small, insignificant part of it. and obviously, the scene created by the third level of the road to Tao Master, or rather, the scene created by the fifth tribulation, coincided with the true appearance of the state of chaos. That was to say, if there really existed such a wonderful world and such a wonderful spacetime, then it could only be a certain level of the state of chaos. At least, in Luo Fan's understanding, this was the only possibility, so, it's the chaos. After understanding this, Luo Fan felt that his perspective began to improve crazily, and he began to constantly surpass it. In his eyes, the world clusters began to increase as his perspective continued to improve, one after another, piece after piece. Among those newly added world clusters, some had parts of Luo Fan's body integrated into them, while some were completely blank, just existing, completely unrelated to him. Some of them had the same Luo Fan collecting parts of Luo Fan's body, while some were still in chaos, and none of them could gain the upper hand in the end and become independent. Such changes continued. At a certain moment, he seemed to break through a certain boundary, and suddenly everything became clear. A boundless, mysterious, and even full of vitality came into his eyes. Looking down below, there was an island that was insignificant compared to the whole world, and could even be called an island that was like a speck of dust. Looking up, around the island, there was a boundless ocean. In the distance there was a black line from the left of the world to the right of the world, as if it had completely divided the whole world into two parts. That was obviously the main continent of the world. It's just an island. I thought this was the whole of the world. At that moment, Luo Fan sighed inwardly, and a strange sense of melancholy rose from the bottom of his heart. At that moment, he frowned and realized that many senses and gazes had risen to the same level as him. They began to see the scenery in his eyes, and the truth of the countless world clusters below. Among these gazes and senses, Luo Fan could sense an extremely familiar feeling. It was the feeling of another Luo Fan. Clearly, although not all of them, most of the Luo Fan with independent will were like him. They had thought of the truth that he had comprehended before, and their vision had risen. In the end, they arrived at the real world, and saw the scenery in front of them clearly. At that moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. This is a good chance. Immediately, his body stepped out of the membrane group of worlds without any hesitation, and he began to rise in the direction that his vision had risen, continuously surpassing the void. At that moment, the membrane group of worlds seemed to be pulled by a huge force, and it began to collapse and shrink towards him. When he completely surpassed the membrane group of worlds, the entire membrane group of worlds had shrunk to the size of a small dot, and it had completely fused with his body. As he fused with the membrane world group, his body grew immeasurably. Finally, he became a colossal existence in the eyes of the other living beings in the other membrane world group. The speed at which he ascended became increasingly faster. As he rose to this level, the suction force on his body became even stronger, and it produced an even more powerful force. It also formed a powerful pull on the surrounding worlds, causing several dozen world clusters to be pulled by him. Like the membrane group of worlds from before, they began to shrink rapidly, and they gradually fused with his body. This change instantly stirred up a large area of the world cluster of worlds into chaos. In a short period of time, similar changes appeared in many unknowns. Luo Fan rushed into the sky, uplifting himself, wanting to devour his own world clusters, strengthen himself, transcend the restrictions of these world clusters, truly uplifting into the true world. However, it was a pity that the importance of sequence was completely shown at this moment. The first to realize this and react was the Luo Fan of the membrane group of world. As such, when the other Luo Fan took action, he had already surpassed the other Luo Fan by several levels. In other words, while the other Luo Fan were still eyeing the worlds that they had grown up in, this Luo Fan had already started to devour and fuse with hundreds and thousands of worlds. In this way, the result was obvious. This Luo Fan was constantly changing his knowledge, shifting the many worlds that had already reacted to his surroundings through the changes in his knowledge, and immediately devouring and fusing them into his body. As he made this choice, more and more Luo Fan with independent will fused into his body, and the memories they possessed were gradually obtained by Luo Fan. As his memories recovered, the principles and mysteries he had comprehended in the past began to fill in. With that, Luo Fan's attainment began to rise by leaps and bounds. Moreover, at a glance, he was already Luo Fan of the highest level. None of the other independent wills could compare to him. As expected, at this level, what matters in battle is one's perception. At this moment, Luo Fan gained an unprecedented deep understanding of his past understanding of cultivation. At the lower end of cultivation, it was a battle of talent and aptitude. At the middle end, it was a battle of comprehension and Tao heart. But at the higher end, such as the false saint level, it was a battle of perception. This could already be seen from the many perception theurgy performed by the Tao Lord's disciples. After all, the foundation of perception theurgy was in perception. Without a powerful perception, no matter how powerful the theurgy was, it would only be a silver spear. However, at this moment, by quickly understanding the truth of the countless worlds in front of him, he stood out and surpassed the other Luo Fan. In the end, it was very likely that he would be the one to complete Luo Fan and grow into the real Luo Fan. This made him truly understand how important this perception was. The other Luo Fan were also Luo Fan. They also had the thoughts of Luo Fan, the cultivation realm of Luo Fan, and his perception. As such, it was naturally impossible for them to willingly give up on themselves and directly integrate into the bodies of other Luo Fan to become a complete part of Luo Fan. Therefore, during this process, they erupted with a world-shaking resistance. The world was destroyed, and the clusters of worlds collapsed. All sorts of changes that were so terrifying that ordinary cultivators could not bear to watch happened almost every single moment during this process. However, as mentioned before, they were also Luo Fan, and their way of thinking was also Luo Fan's way of thinking. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan, who had already grown to an extremely high level, could naturally guess their thoughts and understand their methods. In this way, under the pressure of a stronger power and a higher realm, the outcome of the resistance was already imaginable. No one knew how long the change lasted. It seemed to have been tens of millions of years, but it also seemed to have only been a few days. When Luo Fan finally returned to his senses, he realized that he had become a complete Luo Fan. Everything that was different from Luo Fan's memories, different from Luo Fan's pain, and different from Luo Fan's thoughts were all merged into one. He was the true Luo Fan. What a tribulation! I almost couldn't make it back. Even though he had merged back into one, Luo Fan could not help but feel a lingering fear. Although the process of passing through the tribulation seemed relatively simple, one of them had obtained the truth of the world at the first moment, and then stood out and began to fuse with the other world groups, finally completing the fusion of all independent wills of Luo Fan. However, all of this was so coincidental that he did not dare to hope that it would happen again. After all, while the enlightenment that Luo Fan obtained seemed to be natural, it was in fact a little strange. The situation of the many world groups was so mysterious, and there could have been many possibilities. However, among those possibilities, that Luo Fan had grasped the only correct possibility, and in the end, he stood out and surpassed the other Luo Fans, and began to fuse with them. It was to the extent that the other Luo Fans were able to obtain the same comprehension because of his existence, his guidance. If not for that, the advantage that Luo Fan had would not have been so great. There seems to be some mystery guiding that me. At this moment, as he recalled, Luo Fan noticed many things that he had not noticed before, and he faintly understood. The appearance of this situation was so coincidental, so perfect, but it meant that there was definitely some power guiding him in a way that he could not understand. Who is it? Many thoughts gathered at this moment, and this was a question. That mystery definitely had a master. As for who that master was, and why he was doing this, he could not understand it at all. With a slight thought, he looked around, and saw a faintly discernible mysterious existence hidden in the sky. When he carefully sensed it, that mysterious existence disappeared without a trace in a flash, as if it had never existed. What a pity! Looks like I still can't discover that mystery. He sighed and retracted his gaze. He lowered his head and saw that the island below had completely collapsed. A large part of the island above the sea had been completely cut off, and only ruins that seemed to have been gnawed on by some wild beast were left. As for all the matter within, it had already fused with Luo Fan's body. Or, to be more precise, the matter that the island had lost had already been refined by Luo Fan through his own extraordinary methods, and finally turned into this Luo Fan who was floating in the void and looking into the distance. After all, Luo Fan's body actually existed in a certain space-time within that matter. Such an existence did not exist in this world at all. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to leave those worlds and appear in this world, what he had to do was naturally to recondense a body that could be accepted by this world. Only with this body would he be able to descend to this world and transcend the numerous worlds. In other words, he seemed to be constantly transcending himself and breaking away from the various world. In fact, his technique was, in a fundamental sense, constantly refining bodies that had transcended the layers of world. In the end, he had finally formed a true body. That was why he was able to stand in the sky and look down on everything in this world. At this moment, layers of ripples appeared in the void. As the ripples spread, a large hand appeared in the void and brazenly grabbed towards him. The large hand looked fair and delicate, and it was indescribably beautiful. But at this time, the giant hand descended from the sky with a destructive momentum, fiercely falling towards Luo Fan. Faced with such a large hand, Luo Fan's heart trembled. There was no time for him to do anything else, and he instinctively took action. He suddenly raised his hand, and a ray of light shot out from his hand. It condensed into a sharp sword in the void, and with a brazen charge, it had already transcended space-time and arrived before the large hand. It stabbed into the palm. This ray of light was none other than a concept ability. However, the concept contained within the concept ability was a sharp concept. In other words, it was a concept that described and defined sharpness. The large hand clearly didn't expect Luo Fan to react so quickly and counterattack so forcefully. It didn't even have time to react before the sword stabbed into the palm and emerged from the back of the hand. Then, the sword trembled slightly, and the large hand was instantly sliced into countless pieces. It turned into a puff of smoke in an instant. As the sword swept through it, the smoke dispersed in the blink of an eye, gradually fusing with the ocean below and disappearing without a trace. At this moment, a groan rang out in the distance. This moan was extremely delicate and pleasant to the ears. Just from the sound alone, one could tell that this was definitely an extremely beautiful woman,